The sun was just beginning to rise over the small town of Pallet and people and Pokémon were beginning to stir. However, in a small house situated right in the center of the little valley that cradled Pallet Town, in a bedroom on the second floor, was a boy. This boy was sitting at his desk, reading a book titled Legendaries of the Pokémon World under a small reading lamp. He appeared to be no older than 5 years old. The young boy had his attention focused entirely on what he was reading until the sun's early morning rays of light finally began to illuminate his bedroom. As soon as it did so, the boy looked towards his window and got a huge smile on his face, instantly turning off his lamp light and closing the book he was reading in the process. The child then ran to his window with the book held tightly in his hands and, opening the window, he climbed out onto the overhang under it and grabbed onto a nearby drain spout. Then, just like a monkey, he began climbing up to the top of the roof. Once at his destination, the young boy plopped down on the edge with his legs dangling off of the end and proceeded to stare at the still rising sun, which was slowly making its way over the distant ocean that resided out past Pallet Town Harbor. As the boy watched the sun continue to rise with that same smile on his face, he felt absolutely calm and at peace. Watching the sunrise was something that he almost always did and was a kind of morning ritual for him. He soon turned his head and looked over into the near distance where Professor's Oak Lab was situated just atop the hill. The child noticed that the lights in the lab suddenly came on, signaling that the professor had just awoken and was getting ready to begin his day caring for and studying all of the many Pokémon at the Oak Ranch. After the sun had finally risen, the boy just sat there in peace and opened up the book he had been reading earlier. Once he found the place he had left off, he began reading again. Chapter 28, Higher Legendaries or God Legendaries. The creator, Arceus. Arceus is often referred to as the creator of all, or God of all Pokémon. Not much is known about this supposedly all-powerful Pokémon except what has been told in the myths and legends of ancient people. Much like many of the other, higher legendaries, Arceus' very existence is more often than not questioned by the scientific community and most of the general populace as a whole. The reason for such skepticism is owed purely to the fact that nothing is known about this Pokémon. No evidence of its existence has ever been found and the only sightings that have ever been recorded are from ancient times. Legends tell us that Arceus was a Pokémon of incredible and potentially dangerous power. Being that it is the god of all Pokémon, Arceus was said to also be the most powerful of all Pokémon. Arceus' appearance is merely guessed at, but from ancient scrolls and texts, most can deduce that it was a Pokémon of immense size. However, it was said to be able to change its overall size to whatever it so chose. Arceus was also said to glow with a radiant and powerful light that was rumored to equal the very heavens themselves in beauty and luster. Arceus supposedly had 1,000 arms that was each endowed with a different power or ability that it could bestow upon those lucky enough to be deemed worthy. Many legends say that this is how humans and Pokémon became able to use hidden powers and abilities in the first place. It is also said that Arceus was able to change its type and the kind of power it could use, completely at random, by utilizing the power of mystical, elemental plates, that Arceus was able to absorb into itself. According to legend, Arceus was able to use an attack that was so powerful it could level mountains and decimate landscapes to absolutely nothing if it was used at full power. The kind of elemental plate that Arceus was merged with at the time also affected the type of this all-powerful attack, according to tales. Arceus was said to be able to perform feats of pure wonder. It could create anything it so desired with merely a force of will. This was how the legendary creation trio and Lake Guardians of Sinnoh were said to have been created. It could also bend the very threads of reality and create whole new dimensions if it so chose. It is also said that there is a link between Arceus and the Aura Guardians of old. The only known evidence that has been found to support this theory was found amongst the ruins at Celestic Town in the Sinnoh region. An image engraved into a particular set of ruins shows Arceus floating high in the sky with the creation trio and Lake Guardians directly below it. The ruins also showed humans and Pokémon looking up at them from down upon the earth. However, what many find the most puzzling is the image of a figure that looks remarkably like a human floating beside of Arceus on a pair of celestial wings, shrouded in some kind of energy. The figure is seen looking down on the rest of the world along with Arceus, leading some to think that this being and Arceus were equals. The only reason that this figure is linked to the fabled and long-past Aura Guardian race of humans is because of the aura-esque energy surrounding the figure. Still, much like Arceus itself, this figure's existence is heavily debated. Arceus' gender is also unknown, as well as many other questions that surround this Pokémon of myth. Unless more evidence of this supposed creator is found, then it is likely that the mysteries and questions surrounding it will remain forever unanswered. For now, this Pokémon remains as likely nothing more than a child's bedtime story. As the young boy finished reading the chapter on Arceus, his head was swimming with everything he had just learned about it. He was beyond excited now and would have given anything to be able to meet that fabled Pokémon. And it wasn't just because of how cool Arceus sounded either. This particular Pokémon seemed like one he could learn about forever and never get bored. Which was a problem he encountered regularly. The boy was just about to start reading the next chapter when he heard his mother call out to him from in the house. If it wouldn't have been for his open window, then he probably would not have heard her from up on the roof. As he climbed back down to his window and stepped into his room, the boy put his book away with all of his others and then ran downstairs. He was still in his sleepwear, which consisted of a pair of black shorts and shirt. As he reached the bottom of the stairs and entered the living room, he could immediately smell breakfast coming from the kitchen. The boy smiled widely and his stomach started growling in hunger as he made his way towards the smell as fast as he could. Upon entering the kitchen, the boy spotted his mother at the stove busily cooking breakfast. "Morning, Mommy," he greeted cheerfully. His mother turned around and smiled sweetly before she left the stove and went over to give him a big hug. "Good morning, my sweet little Ashie. Happy birthday." The boy, now identified as none other than Ash Ketchum, smiled back at his parent brightly. "Thanks, Mommy. Is breakfast ready yet?" His tone was enthused and excited. His mother, Delia, giggled at her son's one-track mind for food. "Almost, dear. Why don't you go and sit down at the table while I finish making up your special birthday breakfast?" The young boy allowed an even bigger smile to form on his face. "Okay, Mommy." Ash then ran to the table and sat down, looking so eager for his special breakfast that he might have fallen from his seat with a little too much bouncing. Delia smiled at her son's anxiousness and then went back to the stove and finished the food. 5 minutes later, she set Ash's breakfast down in front of him. It consisted of Pidgey eggs, toast, a fruit assortment, organic Grumpig sausage and bacon, a blueberry muffin and a bowl of cinnamon oatmeal. Ash's eyes shimmered with excitement as he looked at his food. "Thanks, Mommy," he gratefully said in thanks just before he began eating his big breakfast. Delia went and poured herself a cup of coffee and then came back and sat at the table. Sipping her coffee, she simply watched as her son happily ate his breakfast without a care in the world. As she looked on at Ash eating with such enjoyment, she was reminded of Richard. He would always eat the same way when it came to her cooking. The only difference between the way Richard and Ash ate was that when the former sat down to a meal, it was with the table manners of a wild Mankey and the appetite of a ravenous Snorlax. When Ash ate, it was still with the appetite of a Snorlax, which is one reason why Delia was so glad that Richard continued to send money in large sums to her every month, but the boy's table manners were far better than his father's own. She had drilled into her son, ever since he was old enough to lift a spoon to his face on his own, all about proper table etiquette. Specifically speaking, not to behave like an animal when eating. Even though he had never met his father, Ash took after Richard in a lot of ways. Delia was fine with him taking on the positive qualities of her husband, but when it came to his not-so-great traits, such as his horrible table manners, Delia was determined not to let that happen. She had made it a personal goal to ensure that Ash learned all about proper table manners, being polite and also how to behave as a gentleman by the time he turned 10 years old and was ready to begin his own journey with Pokémon. Professor Oak had indeed turned out to be right years ago after all. Ash did want to go on his own Pokémon journey when he was old enough, desperately. Actually, it was all the boy could ever talk about. Even as a young 5-year-old, Ash was showing himself to be a very intelligent child and had a motive for everything that he did. And it just so happened that everything he did had something to do with preparing for the journey that he wouldn't even be able to go on for another 5 years. Professor Oak was also right when he had said that Ash would end up loving Pokémon just like Richard. However, Delia could say that the professor was wrong about one thing, and that was when he said that Ash would love Pokémon just as much as his father. The truth was, Ash adored Pokémon even more than Richard did. And that was something that Delia never even thought possible. The second word that came out of his mouth after "Mama" was Pokémon, if that was anything to go by. Ash was literally obsessed with everything to do with Pokémon. He lived, ate and breathed nothing but that subject. Sometimes she became a little worried with Ash's constant obsession, but every time she would see the joy in her son's eyes when Pokémon came up, Delia couldn't possibly believe that something that brought him so much happiness could ever be bad for him. The only thing stranger than Ash's absolute love for Pokémon was how they in turn also seemed to adore him. When he was just a baby and then as a toddler, Delia would always have to be very careful when she took him to Professor Oak's lab to see the Pokémon. Which was something that he always wanted to do. Every time she ever took Ash out into the fields of the ranch with the professor, she would always need to keep him with her at all times and could barely ever let him out of her sight. If she'd put him down for 1 second to do something and then turned back around to pick him up again, her son would be surrounded by Pokémon. All of them trying just to get to him in some way. Of course, this would always make Ash squeal in excitement at being so close to the Pokémon. For Delia, however, it would scare her a little bit thinking that her son might get hurt around all of the Pokémon who were much bigger than him. So, she would always pick Ash back up and hold him, which was where she felt he was safest. Either way though, one thing was for certain. Ash definitely had a very close connection with Pokémon that even Professor Oak couldn't explain. Delia continued to watch her son fondly as he ate his food, and she kept thinking about just how special he truly was. For being 5 years old, Ash was very mature for his age. He knew he wanted to be a Pokémon trainer and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that dream a reality. Unlike most kids his age, such as Gary, who was Delia's best friend Amelia's son and older than Ash by a month, Ash himself had very different interests. Gary also wanted to be a Pokémon trainer, and he too was obviously excited for the day that he would receive his first Pokémon from his grandfather, Professor Oak. Much like how many trainers who were just starting out felt in the beginning. However, Ash was by far the one who was taking it the most seriously. While other kids were out playing around everywhere and pretty much just being children, Ash was always studying and reading new things about Pokémon. Not to say that he didn't play though, he did quite often. Although, usually that was only when he was playing with the Pokémon at Professor Oak's lab. He didn't even watch TV like normal kids, or normal people in general for that matter. The only time Delia ever recalled seeing him watch TV was when the Pokémon League was televising competitions that were being held. And since it was obviously all about trainers and their Pokémon battling it out in the biggest tournaments that could be held in a region, Ash was obviously glued to the TV screen watching the whole thing. Delia chalked that up as at least one thing her child did that was normal for a kid his age. That was until at least, she once saw him watching a league battle with a notepad in his hand. When she questioned her son as to why he had a notepad with him, he simply replied by telling her that he was analyzing Pokémon battle strategies that he hoped would help him, in turn, develop his own. Delia really couldn't say she was surprised. That was just the way her son was. One thing that did constantly surprise her though was just how gifted and extremely intelligent Ash was. By 3 months old he had already said his first word. At 6 months he was already walking, and by 1.5 years old he could read. By 3 years old he was reading professional-grade Pokémon research magazines and very advanced books on Pokémon theory. And now, at 5 years old, which was how old he actually turned today, Ash was analyzing Pokémon battle strategies and studying Pokémon behavior. Delia was suddenly dragged from her thoughts by her son, who had just finished eating and was trying to get her attention. "Mommy. Mommy, are you listening?" She quickly shook her head and then looked at her child. "What, Ash? I'm sorry, I was just thinking." Ash looked concerned at his mother's facial expression, which appeared as though she was still thinking about something. "Is it about Daddy?" The brunette immediately seemed surprised. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Why would you say I was thinking about Daddy?" A very sad look came across his face. "Because it's another one of my birthdays that he's not here for." The young boy began to tear up. "Maybe he doesn't want to see me, maybe Daddy doesn't like me, did I do something wrong, Mommy?" By this point, tears began falling down Ash's face. Delia automatically hurried to her crying son and engulfed him in a warm hug. Soon, he was sobbing into his mother's chest. "Ash," she began softly while trying to console the distraught child. "Ash, please look at Mommy." He finally lifted his head and looked at his mother. Tear tracks stained his cheeks and his eyes were now red from crying. She took her son's face gently into her hands and smiled. "Ash, listen to me, your daddy doesn't not like you. He left to continue his Pokémon journey before he even knew that I was pregnant with you." Since Ash was so mature and intelligent for his age, Delia never tried to hide things from him and tell the usual, white lies, that most parents did with their children. Like when they came asking questions about where babies came from. Besides, she had tried that already with Ash and he had merely stared at her with such a disbelieving and knowing expression, that it freaked her out a little. She decided right then and there that she would never try something like that with her boy again. With a child like Ash, honesty was always the best policy. The woman smiled gently at her son again while rubbing her hand through his messy dark locks. "I know for a fact that if he had known about you when I was pregnant, he would have come rushing home from wherever he was just so he could be here for you. If he only knew about how he has missed 5 years of your life, it would break his heart. Your daddy is a very good man and if he were to meet you, I know that he would love you just as much as I do." Ash's tears had finally stopped and he was no longer crying. "Do you really think so, Mommy?" he asked vulnerably while looking up at her. "I know so," she reassured firmly as she pulled away from her son and held him at arm's length. Ash had another tear fall down his face as he slowly and sadly questioned. Will I ever get to see Daddy?" Delia engulfed her son in yet another tight hug while a silent tear fell down her own cheek. "I hope so, sweetheart. I hope so." After he had fully calmed down and looked a little better, his mother asked him the one thing that she knew would make him forget about his father. "For now at least. Ash, how would you like to go spend the day at the ranch and see Professor Oak and all the Pokémon there?" The young boy instantly brightened up and tremendously at that. "Really, Mommy? Can we?" Delia smiled right back at him and nodded. "Of course we can, it's your birthday, silly. Now hurry up and go get ready, we'll leave here at 10. Ash smiled with such a shining gleam of happiness that Delia thought she might go blind. He immediately jumped down from the chair and left the kitchen, making a dash for his room so he could get ready to go. The young mother laughed at her son's eagerness and felt glad that he had returned to his normal cheerful self. As she herself went to go and get ready, Delia looked out the window and sighed. "Stay safe, Richard. Me and your son miss you so very much." With that said, Delia went to get herself ready for a day at the lab. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX Delia was dressed in her usual outfit consisting of a blue skirt and a pink, light coat that was clipped at the neck with a single red button. Under that thin overcoat was a yellow undershirt. On her feet were a simple pair of dark blue slip-ons and her long brown hair was tied back with a light blue scrunchie into the same style she had worn since her early days as a teenager. Long before she met Richard. Even though she was now a 26-year-old mother, she didn't look it. Her habit of taking daily jogs, usually with Amelia, and eating right ensured that she remained in good shape. The skirt hugged her lower body and showed just a bit of her long, toned legs. The light coat, meanwhile, accentuated her feminine torso and her modest motherly chest. Ash, meanwhile, was dressed in blue jean shorts, a black t-shirt with a red Pokémon emblem on it and a pair of black and red striped shoes. After they had knocked on the door and waited for a minute, Professor Oak himself answered it, dressed in his usual attire, which was tan slacks, a red button-up shirt tucked into his pants, a white lab coat and brown loafers. After opening the door and seeing who it was, he smiled at his guests and greeted them warmly. "Ah, Delia, good to see you again, my dear. And who is with you? Could it be the birthday boy himself?" Professor Oak knelt down to Ash's level and said the last part while smiling. The young boy beamed up at the older man and replied politely, "Hi Professor Oak, how are you today?" Oak chuckled and nodded. "I am doing very well indeed, thank you for asking, Ash. But more importantly, I think that today is someone's birthday. Am I right?" The child continued to grin broadly and started rubbing the back of his head with his hand in a perfect imitation of Richard. One that both Professor Oak and Delia noticed and softly smiled at. "That's right, Professor. I'm 5 years old today, which means I'm only 5 years away from being able to start my own Pokémon journey." He excitedly pumped his hand into the air as he said this, and Professor Oak smiled back at the boy's enthusiasm. "Well, happy birthday my boy, and you are right. Only 5 more years and you will indeed be ready to start your own adventure with your very own Pokémon." The older man scratched his chin and then allowed a sly grin to appear his face as he continued. "Which means that you need to keep spending as much time with Pokémon as you can. And, as it just so happens, there are many Pokémon out on the ranch, as you know. I think you should go and observe the Pokémon for yourself. Don't you think so, Ash?" Catching onto what the professor was alluding to, Ash smiled his megawatt grin again. "Really, Professor? Can I? By myself?" The older man looked at Delia, who nodded in confirmation that it was all right. "As long as you do not go too far and be careful, then yes you can." He consented with his own smile. Ash, jittery with excitement, jumped at Professor Oak and tackled him in a big hug. Thank you, Professor," Ash repeatedly exclaimed while hugging the older man tightly. The kindly Pokémon researcher just smiled and hugged the boy back. "You are very welcome, my boy. Now go on, have fun." With that, he let Professor Oak go and then went to hug his mother as well before running through the lab as fast as possible and then tearing out the back door that led onto the ranch. The professor chuckled at the boy's excitement and then turned to Delia. "Well, what do you say we have a cup of tea while we let Ash have his fun?" Delia smiled and raised a finger into the air. "Sure, Professor, I'll go put on the kettle." While the two adults prepared to spend their day relaxing and making conversation, neither of them could have known the events about to take place that would forever change young Ash Ketchum. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX Professor Oak watched over resided, he felt a huge burst of excitement at seeing all of the Pokémon spread out across the wide open fields before him. The young boy soon went running down the hill he was standing on at full speed, and once he reached the bottom and hopped the fence to enter the first field, he stopped and looked around, his enthusiastic eyes taking in all of the sights that awaited him on every side. Pokémon were literally everywhere. Different species and types of Pokémon from so many places around the world, all gathered into one place. Ash suddenly felt so at home amongst all of the many Pokémon. He couldn't explain it, but it just felt right for him to be around them as he was now. All of the Pokémon suddenly noticed the boy's arrival and many of them began running at him. Before he could even react, a Growlithe suddenly knocked him over and started smothering him with licks and happy barks. Ash just rolled around on the ground with the puppy Pokémon and laughed like crazy. Others soon joined the two as well. A Snubbull, Vulpix, Ponyta, Pachirisu and Poochyena all swarmed Ash at the same time and also smothered him with affection. By the time they were done and he stood back up, he had a huge smile on his face. "Hey guys, how have you been?" Ash asked excitedly. In return he got several different calls, barks and chirps from the Pokémon gathered around him. "Great. I'm glad you are all doing well. Do you guys want to play with me?" Again, he received several different calls from the Pokémon that all sounded like an enthusiastic yes to him. After that, he and the small group of Pokémon began running around the fields together, playing and having fun everywhere they went as they unknowingly started to near a fence that bordered the massive amounts of property belonging to Professor Oak. Before Ash knew it, he and the Pokémon with him were standing in front of that very same sturdy-looking, full-paneled fence that separated the Oak Ranch from the wild forest on the other side. While the professor had plenty different types of terrain on the ranch to meet the habitation needs of the many Pokémon he harbored for trainers, including several forests, Ash had been warned to never go near this forest before or to even think about stepping foot inside of it. Professor Oak had told him how wild Pokémon was all he would find in the forest and that since they were wild and untamed, the forest-dwelling Pokémon could potentially hurt him. This particular forest wasn't part of the Oak Ranch and therefore, it was dangerous. If there was one thing that Ash had plenty of, it was intelligence and common sense. He knew how much danger he could run into if he went into the forest and had no desire at all to tempt fate and end his life before he even got a chance to become a Pokémon trainer. Just as he and his Pokémon friends were about to turn around and head back into the friendlier parts of the ranch, they heard a loud cry of distress coming from in the forest. As soon as he heard this, Ash stopped dead and then turned back around to look into the forest where the cry had come from. He heard it again and the Pokémon, as he could tell it was, sounded like it was in trouble. The young boy didn't know what to do. He wanted to go and help the distressed Pokémon, but he also knew that he had been expressly told to never go into the forest before. He was completely torn in two and had no idea what to do. Another cry from the forest made his heart ache and he felt like he was going to break if he didn't help the potentially injured Pokémon. But finally, as the Pokémon cried out one last time, he had enough. Ash took off at the border fence separating him from the forest and climbed over top of it. Once he was on the other side, he turned back to his Pokémon friends and yelled, "Don't worry you guys, I'll be fine." He then raised his fist. "I'm going to go help this Pokémon and once I do, I'll be right back." They reluctantly nodded in understanding and then Ash took off into the forest. He ran as fast as his small, 5-year-old legs could take him. Jumping over fallen trees, ducking under branches and pushing through the heavy foliage around him. All the while, he followed the cries of despair until he finally burst through the thick underbrush and came out onto the edge of a large ravine. The gorge itself was huge and separated the forest on either side of it by some distance. The sides were so steep that nothing could climb back up if it fell into it, and the very bottom of the huge ravine was filled with rushing river so forceful, it almost seemed to be powered by hundreds of hydro cannons converged into one. As Ash scanned the area looking for the Pokémon that made the distress calls, he eventually found it hanging onto the edge of the ravine on his side by its paws. It was none other than what he recognized as a Pichu. When Delia's son saw the electric-type Pokémon holding on for dear life, suspended above a perilous cliff with raging rapids below, Ash's instincts kicked in and he took off as fast as he could. Just as the small electric Pokémon was about to lose its grip and fall, he dove for the edge of the cliff and managed to grab its paw as it fell. Pichu, who was surprised by the sudden contact, couldn't help but let loose an electrical charge that went straight into Ash through their connected grip and shocked him. "Ah!" he yelled in pain as he was electrocuted by the surprisingly powerful, unintended attack. But even still, Ash held steadfastly onto Pichu. Enduring the intense pain of being zapped by a penetrating electrical attack, he refused to let go. After the pain of the sudden shock had passed, the still shaking boy pulled Pichu back up onto the top of the ledge and then set the small Pokémon back down and looked at it. Pichu looked back at Ash with wide eyes, not believing that a human had just risked their life to save that of a Pokémon's own. As it looked at Ash and he right back at it, nothing was said for a few long moments. He noticed that this Pichu was male from the fact that it didn't have a cleft in its small lightning bolt-shaped black tail. He recalled how he had read about the Pikachu evolutionary line in a book and that it mentioned how females of that particular rodent species of Pokémon always had a cleft in the tail, whereas the males did not. As Ash took in the Pichu before him, he was impressed with what he saw. Pichu was looking at him with a spark of will and determination in its eyes that shone brightly, even after the terror it had just experienced. He could plainly tell that this Pichu had spirit. He was also impressed with the small Pokémon's Thundershock attack from earlier. Ash had read about how Pichus could never control their electricity until they evolved into Pikachu, and that when they did use electric attacks, it would always rebound and hurt them as well. Mostly since they didn't know how to control their power, and also because their bodies were not yet strong enough to handle such strong electrical energy. This Pichu, however, broke all of the rules on what was considered normal for his current evolution, seemingly young age and size. The Thundershock attack it executed was not only perfectly controlled, but Pichu also took no damage whatsoever, as it should have. Ash could definitely tell that this Pokémon was, without a doubt, special. He really couldn't help but wish, oddly enough in that moment, that Pichu could be his starter Pokémon. But he knew better. All Pokémon given to trainers by Professor Oak were either the grass type, Bulbasaur, the water type, Squirtle, or the fire type, Charmander. This Pichu could never be his starter Pokémon, and sadly, he knew it. Before any more could be said or done between the currently silent pair, the ground suddenly began to give way again under where the small Pokémon was standing. The obviously unstable ground near the edge of the cliff, as well as the fact that there was a berry bush jutting out from the top of it where Pichu initially had fallen, provided an apparently clear cause and effect for how he had ended up in such a position in the first place. Regardless of how any of it had happened or why though, Ash quickly jumped to where the little tiny mouse Pokémon was standing, his mind not catching up with his legs until he was already moving. Then, in an act of pure heroism and self-sacrifice, he pushed Pichu out of the way of the crumbling cliffside. Before Ash could react or save himself, he began falling and tumbled straight over the side of the cliff. As he fell, the last thing the young boy saw and heard before hitting the water far below was the horrified look Pichu had on its face and the shrill cry of, "Pichu!" It gave as the small Pokémon watched him fall. After that, Ash hit the water. As he landed in the raging river, the courageous child was instantly shocked by the coldness of the water and the force with which it began to thrash him around. Every time he would try and rise back to the surface, the current would pull him right back under. Ash felt the air being sucked from his lungs as he continued to splash around and fight just to stay above the water. As he struggled to survive, all he could think of was one thing. "I'm gonna die," he told himself in horror. "I'm never going to see Mommy, Aunt Amelia, Professor Oak, or the Pokémon at the lab ever again. I'm never going to get to meet Daddy or become a Pokémon master." As these thoughts raced through the young boy's mind, he never saw the rock he was heading straight towards until it was too late. Before he could even process what was happening, Ash slammed into the rock head first, immediately losing consciousness and sinking under the water. From there, the current simply washed him away. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX He slowly sat up, groaning as he did so, and looked around, trying to figure out where he was. The boy was shocked to find himself in a big, vast meadow that stretched on as far as the eye could see. The grass he was sitting on felt like cotton beneath him, and it was greener than any fescue he had ever seen before. The sky itself was totally cloudless and the sun was bright, yet not hot. The air also felt uncannily fresh and invigorating. As he stood up and continued to look around, the confused boy suddenly heard a voice that almost sounded like it was the wind itself speaking to him. Ash. He spun around in place, looking for who called his name. After finding no one around in the meadow besides himself, the boy briefly considered that maybe he had hit his head so hard, he was now hearing voices. He even reached up to rub his head where he had hit it, but as soon as he touched the spot where the bruise or wound was supposed to be, he gasped in shock. There was nothing there. Before Ash could wonder any further about what was going on, he heard the voice again, this time louder. He began to get scared as the voice continued getting louder and seemed to now come from everywhere around him, all at once. He soon began running through the meadow, trying to escape the disembodied voice. Ash kept running, looking back behind him to see what or who was calling his name and to see if they were following him. When he turned his head around to face front again, he saw a bright light directly in front of him. Quickly, he shut his eyes from the blinding light, and while doing so, he tripped and fell face forward onto the ground. When Ash looked back up, he saw a truly massive figure step forth from the light. It was so big, the sun itself was blocked out by the form of the huge creature. Once it fully emerged from within the bright light, the portal, of sorts that it had come from, disappeared. Now, standing in the meadow tall and imposing, the giant behemoth was shrouded in its own bright and heavenly glowing light. Ash's first instinct was fear from seeing something so terrifying, and promptly curled himself upon the ground and shivered in fear. He may have been very mature and intelligent for his age, not to mention brave, since he had fallen from a steep cliff into a torrent of raging water just to save the life of a Pokémon. But, even still, he was only 5 years old, and fear very much applied to him in such circumstances. The glow around the majestic creature slowly dissipated a little, finally giving away the identity of the new arrival as none other than the creator and goddess of all Pokémon, Arceus herself. The mighty and majestic Pokémon looked around after finally emerging from the portal that she had made to get her to the current location from the Hall of Origins. She was looking for the one that she had brought to such a place of sanctity, the Chosen One. When she saw the young boy laying before her on the ground, trembling in fear, she knew that this indeed was him. She had not seen him since he was a newborn, but she knew it was him. Her eyes softened at the sight of the scared young child, and she spoke in a voice that was so soft and mellow, it sounded as though her voice were made of silk. "Do not fear me, my dear one. I am not here to hurt you." Ash finally stopped shaking and slowly looked up at the soft and comforting voice that reminded him so much of his mother. When he finally got a good look at the being in front of him, all fear and terror vanished in a heartbeat. He was greeted to the most awe-inspiring sight he had ever seen. Standing before him was a creature that he could only assume was a Pokémon by its appearance. Although, it was completely unlike any Pokémon he had ever seen before. If the Pokémon race had royalty, then this would be it. To that thought, he was sure of it above all else. The giant creature was just that, giant. It truly looked like it had a faint golden glow of some kind radiating around it, and the Pokémon itself resembled something out of a fantasy story. What captivated Ash the most about the mystifying creature was the incredibly warm, caring and yet exceedingly powerful aura it possessed. He wondered briefly if it was same thing as the golden energy he thought he saw around the Pokémon earlier. Ash had stood himself up by now and was staring up at the captivating Pokémon with wide eyes. Once he had finally found his voice, he spoke in a voice full of wonder. "Who are you?" Arceus' eyes almost seemed to glow warmly at the boy before she answered his question. "I am whom you have read about many times before in your books. The one that almost all humans in this world say do not exist. The one that you felt on this very day that you would give anything to meet. I, my dear child, am Arceus." Ash almost had his mouth on the ground in shock. He could not believe that standing right in front of him was none other than the Arceus. The creator of all Pokémon and the master architect of the entire world as he knew it. The young boy simply could not believe that the very Pokémon he had been reading about earlier that day was standing before him and, somehow, speaking to him, even though the mighty creature had no visible mouth. In brief passing he wondered if it was perhaps some form of telepathy like psychics used, which he had also read about. Something that would have made sense given that it felt like Arceus' voice was speaking almost directly into his mind. Nevertheless, he was beyond the point of amazement that the very same mythical Pokémon that pretty much every researcher and professional in the scientific community, throughout the world, was showing itself to him. So many had said Arceus was nothing more than a myth, with the very rare exception of people like Professor Oak, who believed anything in the world of Pokémon was possible, actually keeping an open mind to the possibility. Yet, here the proof was, standing right before him. He, at 5 years old, had managed to answer a question that no Pokémon researcher on planet Earth ever could. Arceus was real, and to top it all off, the creation Pokémon was apparently a female too, if the feminine-sounding voice he heard was accurate. Whatever Arceus was expecting the child to do, it was nothing compared to what happened next. The young boy began jumping around in excitement while cheering in celebration. I can't believe I'm actually here with the Arceus. This is the best birthday ever. Arceus was dumbfounded. This young boy had just been through a trauma. Falling off a cliff face 100 feet down into a deathly tide of rapids and then getting knocked unconscious by a large rock, not to mention very nearly being drowned. If it had not been for her intervening, pulling the boy from the river and transporting him here with her power, as well as healing the injuries to his head, he would have been dead. To top it all off, this same boy had just encountered the most powerful Pokémon in the world and the creator of the very planet that he lived on. And here he now was, dancing around like he had just been named a Pokémon master. Arceus could only hum in amusement and shake her head. If what she was seeing now was true, as well as all of the times she had watched this young boy from the Hall of Origins, then he was truly going to do amazing things in his life. Not to mention bring many smiles and much joy to other people's lives as well. The fact that he never once questioned if the current scenario was real or not, which it most certainly was, also further amused her. The boy had great faith. Ash soon stopped dancing around though and looked straight up at Arceus with no fear in his eyes whatsoever now. Miss Arceus, if you don't mind me asking, where are we exactly? This doesn't look like anything back home. Everything just seems too perfect here, he commented astutely. Arceus smiled at the boy's curiosity and was also impressed with his intelligent observation. We, my child, are in a dimension between dimensions. A cross between your world and mine, blended together. I brought you here after I saved you from those rapids and then I healed your injuries with my power. You have been asleep for nearly 6 hours now. Ash's eyes suddenly went very wide at her last statement. 6 hours. My mommy and everyone else are probably going crazy right now. They're gonna be so mad at me. The worried youngling appeared like he might fall unconscious again out of anxiety, so Arceus put his mind at ease. Dear one, time here on this plane and time in your dimension are in complete contrast with one another. What has been 6 hours here in this dimension have really only been 6 minutes in the normal world. Ash visibly relaxed at that and Arceus decided to comfort him further. In fact, I can show you what your mother and that kindly old human are doing right now if you wish. He immediately looked shocked. You can do that, from here? Arceus chuckled at his question. Of course I can, young one. I am the most powerful Pokémon in the world, you know. Ash looked sheepish and scratched the back of his head. Yeah. Sorry, I kind of forgot, hee. Arceus just chuckled again in amusement. That is quite alright, dear, I understand. Now, stand back please. He did as told, and once he was a good ways back, she focused her energy and then opened a portal out of thin air. As the shimmering, silvery white portal shifted and took form, it showed a crystal clear image of Delia and Professor Oak. They were sitting in the living room area of the lab, on the second floor, talking and drinking tea. The window in the room was open as well, and they would do that whenever he was playing out in the ranch so she and the professor could listen for him if something happened. Ash looked at the image in amazement. There his family was, clear as day, right in front of him. Arceus closed the portal and the image of the two conversing adults disappeared. He still seemed shocked. Now, better? She asked the still stunned child. Ash lamely nodded his head in a gesture of yes. Good, because we have many things to discuss. Very important matters concerning yourself and your destiny. His face took on a look of confusion. What do you mean, my destiny? The boy asked, very curious and more than a little perplexed. Arceus settled herself in for a rather long explanation before she began. Yes, my child, your destiny. You are very, very special and very important to the whole world. Your very existence was predetermined long before you were ever born. You were prophesied from the very beginning of the human and Pokémon world that I created so long ago. You are destined for greatness, the likes of which has never been seen before. You will bring peace and balance to the world, as well as fight and defeat many great evils who will rise to take the world for themselves. You will accomplish feats of such magnitude that many people will come to revere you greatly. In the world of Pokémon, you will become a trainer of such greatness that your abilities in battle with your partner Pokémon will dwarf that of even the greatest of Pokémon champions who stand tall today. Pokémon will flock to you and love you like no one has ever experienced before. You, my young one, are the chosen one. Ash was speechless. First, he had a near-death experience, then he met the goddess of all Pokémon. Now, the great creator herself was telling him, a 5-year-old boy, that he was destined to save the world many times over, accomplish feats of such greatness that he would be revered by practically everyone and become a Pokémon master so great that none of the current Pokémon regional champions could match up to him. It was safe to say, Ash was on overload. Arceus saw this and continued. You will face great challenges and many obstacles on your way to greatness, young one. So many in fact that no other person could ever hope to overcome such tasks and challenges. The young boy appeared even more stupefied at the information he was getting blasted with continuously. Arceus decided to use that same time to get down to business. Child, answer me a question. He looked up at the almighty legendary and nodded, showing that he understood, and also for her to continue. Do you want to become the greatest Pokémon master there has ever been? Ash's face became one of utter seriousness. Yes, more than anything. One day I will be the greatest Pokémon master there ever has been. His words were alight with fire and passion. Arceus looked at him with pride. She had chosen a truly worthy human to be the chosen one. Or at least, someone had chosen the right human for her to create. Very well then, young one, that is exactly what I wanted to hear from you. Your path is going to be a long and difficult one, this is true. However, that is why I am here. She rose herself up and looked down on him regally. I will be watching over you always. At any time you need me, I shall be there for you. Now, are you ready to take the first steps in becoming the greatest Pokémon master there has been or ever will be? Ash firmly nodded. In his eyes was a fire and ferocity that could be seen and felt. Something far beyond the ordinary, especially for a young 5-year-old. Yes, Arceus, I'm ready. Anything to achieve my dream. And as for saving the world, well, I don't know if I can, but everyone I love and care about are all a part of the world. If saving them means saving the world, then, no matter how many times I need to put my life on the line, I'll do it. Arceus felt even more pride grow for her young chosen one as he said those words. For Arceus, it also confirmed something about the young boy that she had suspected but did not yet know for certain. Namely, the true mystery surrounding Ash that even she herself did not understand or know entirely. A little-known secret that was actually known only to herself was that the prophecy which spoke of Ash's coming had not been made by her. In truth, the prophecy itself had been passed into her conscious knowledge shortly after she came into being at the beginning and formed the universe. Arceus may have been called the creation Pokémon, but even she did not know of what she was or where she came from before emerging from the egg of eternity. Because of this, there were some mysteries and secrets even she did not know. Such as the young boy before her, where the ability to actually create life itself originally came from, and what happened to the dead when they passed on. For humans and Pokémon. Concerning Ash though, while Arceus knew that their destinies were intertwined and that she was supposed to bring him into being with the privilege she had of giving life to humans, she did not know everything about him or the origin behind his existence. For the greatest of all Pokémon, Arceus herself was even left to wonder when it came to certain things concerning him. Chief among them being the mannerisms in which the boy already possessed at such an extremely young age. While she knew that he would be far beyond many children and peers his own age in terms of maturity and personal growth, almost to the point of seeming strange and abnormal to people that did not know or understand him, even she was surprised at the extent to which it was true. To hear a 5-year-old child pronounce such strong convictions was almost ludicrous, even laughably silly in the minds of many. Yet here he was doing that very thing now. To Arceus herself it was astonishing, even perplexing. Regardless, she did not question it. She could not question it. Instead, she went with it as she knew she had to and accepted it as it was. And with that in mind, she continued in her address to the child. Then to become the greatest Pokémon master there has ever been, you are going to have to train and work harder than anyone before you ever has. For this dream you aspire to achieve is not accomplished through simply battling, raising strong Pokémon and winning alone. There is much more to it than such vain pursuits by themselves. Such as becoming truly at one with Pokémon, heart and soul. Ash looked thoughtful for a long moment at all she said before he replied. What kind of training though, Arceus? I've already been reading and studying hard on everything to do with Pokémon to prepare myself for my journey. She stared down at him intently. I know you have, young one, and I am proud of you for all you have done to prepare yourself thus far. However, you will need to do much more training and studying to be ready for your journey in 5 years' time. You will need to learn everything you can about Pokémon behavior, battling strategies, breeding cycles, migratory patterns, type matchups and many other subjects on Pokémon. You will also have to learn much about many other things such as survival and the culinary arts so that you can feed yourself as well as your Pokémon on your travels. She paused for a moment before continuing. You will need to learn proper self-defense so that you are not always dependent upon your Pokémon for protection and can even defend them or others if need be. This will also call for you to endure arduous and intensive physical and mental training so that you can be in the best shape you possibly can be in before you set out on your journey. Arceus blinked once and then finished wisely. There are many things you must learn between now and then to fully prepare yourself for the great destiny ahead of you, young one. Yet, even then, there are some things that you shall only learn upon going out into the world with your own Pokémon partners and experiencing life firsthand. When she was done, he remained pensive and silent for a long time, simply staring off into space. She began to think that perhaps it was all too much, too soon. That she had dumped too much on him at one time while overestimating his ability to properly process it all. Just as she was about to say something, however, Ash lifted his gaze to meet hers again with that same seriousness and fire in his eyes from before that once more mystified Arceus. He then spoke in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone much older than himself. As if, in that moment, he was not really Ash Ketchum at all. I'll do it, he stated firmly. If that is what it takes to become the greatest Pokémon master ever and also to defend my family, the ones I love, from any evil that ever tries to take over the world, then so be it. I will train harder than anyone before me ever has and I won't stop. I will never stop training and striving to get stronger and better alongside my future Pokémon. I promise you that, Arceus. Arceus was taken aback yet again by the young boy's heartfelt and passionate proclamation. In the course of the mere 10 minutes that Ash had been completely silent, it was almost as if he had come to terms with something inside of himself and now stood before the divine Pokémon totally changed. To her, it was as if she could actually sense that some other part within the boy had awoken and utterly changed him. A part even she did not fully comprehend. Arceus was only in that state of wonder for a passing moment though, and then felt that same rush of pride for the young boy come rushing back again. She responded back to the changed young Ketchum's intense proclamation with her own. I know that you will become the greatest Pokémon master this world has ever seen, young one. With determination and the drive to constantly get better and improve yourself, as well as your Pokémon, this dream will be within your reach. If you never give up on yourself and keep the support of your loved ones close to your heart, there is nothing that you cannot do. Face the challenges you will encounter in the future with courage and strength and you will always overcome them. Never stop having faith in yourself, my child, and someday you will stand above all others and be recognized for the greatness that you have achieved. Ash, feeling changed inside himself in some strange way, merely smiled and nodded resolutely at her words. Thank you, Arceus. Thank you for having such faith in me. She tilted her head at the child's gratitude and then responded. You are most welcome, young one. Now, I believe you have been here for long enough, don't you? I think it is time you return to the world and show them just who Ash Ketchum really is. After saying that, Arceus began to glow and was then surrounded by the same bright shroud of light that she had been cloaked in upon first arriving. Suddenly, a bright beam shot out from her and struck the airspace in front of Ash, forming a small portal that had the image of Oak's lab on the other side. She then turned to Ash, still glowing brightly and causing him to squint his eyes as he looked up at her. It is time to leave now, young one. Go and show the world what the chosen one can really do. Always remember this as well, my child. Whenever you need me, I shall come to your aid. The young boy gave Arceus a thumbs up. You got it. I promise, Arceus, I will become the best. With that said, he stepped through the portal to go back home. Right before he disappeared though, Arceus heard him say, I'll make you proud. The mythical and fabled Pokémon only hummed warmly in reply. I know you will, my child, I know you will. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX of the Oak Ranch. Upon closer observation, he realized that it was the exact same spot by the border fence that he had been at earlier when he went into the forest to save Pichu. Ash didn't get a chance to do anything else though because he was suddenly tackled to the ground by several Pokémon. Before long, he was assaulted by licks, barks, happy yips and chirps as he lay sprawled on the ground. When he finally got back to his feet a short time later, Ash recognized the Pokémon that tackled him as the same ones whom he had been playing with earlier before he went running off in search of the distressed electric type in the forest. As he stood up and looked at all of the Pokémon who were so happy to see him, the boy smiled and put his hands on his hips. "Hey guys, did you miss me that bad?" They all called out in excitement, showing through vocalization how relieved they were to see him. Ash chuckled at that and alternated between rubbing and stroking each one of them comfortingly. "I'm sorry I worried you guys so much, but you'll be happy to know that I was able to help that Pokémon who was in trouble. It was actually a Pichu, believe it or not. And a really cool one too." Ash then went on to explain to his Pokefriends all about what had happened to him while he was gone. The Pokémon themselves all showed their shock when he got to the part about Arceus, but they recovered their composure eventually and then looked at the boy with even more reverence than they had before. If the creation Pokémon Arceus herself was taking a special interest in Ash, they knew he was even more special for a human than they had originally perceived. Once Ash was done talking with and reassuring his Pokémon friends, he started making his way back up to the Oak Laboratory to talk to his mother and Professor Oak. He had been thinking about what Arceus had told him a lot, and she was right. He was going to have to train extremely hard if he wanted to be stronger than any other trainer out there. Especially the champions and Elite Four, since they were the strongest of the strong. Ash believed that if he dedicated himself to training into the ground like a Diglett, then by the end of 5 years, he would be more than ready to start his Pokémon journey. First, however, he needed to talk to his mom and Professor Oak. He knew that they were instrumental to the training regimen he already had cooking up in his mind. And so, after Ash made it to the main gate separating the lab from the fields of the ranch, he bid his friends goodbye and walked up to the back door of the lab that led inside. Not only was the persona and the aura around the boy different now, but, as his Pokémon companions watched him leave, they could tell that he even held himself in a changed manner. As Ash walked through the main ground floor area of the lab and then up the stairs to the second floor, he remembered Arceus showing him via the portal from earlier where his mom and Professor Oak had been. After making it up onto the elevated platform above the lab, he turned to the green door on the right-hand side and opened it up. As he stepped into the living area, Ash saw Professor Oak sitting on one couch by the coffee table, nearest the window, and his mom on the other sofa across from him. They were both in conversation and didn't notice him until he walked around the backside of his mother's couch and made himself known. "Hi honey," Delia cheerfully greeted as soon as she saw him. "Ah Ash, good to see you back my boy." Professor Oak also greeted in the kind, grandfatherly way that he always treated the young Ketchum with. "Hi Mom, Professor Oak. Did you guys have a good day?" Delia, who was more than little surprised at Ash calling her Mom, instead of his usual, Mommy, answered for the two of them. "Yes we did, thank you for asking. What about you sweetie? Did you have a good day playing with the Pokémon?" Ash nodded and then sat down on the armchair between she and Professor Oak. "I actually need to talk to you guys about something very important." He began seriously as he looked at both of them in turn. He didn't look like a 5-year-old boy at present but someone who instead was on a mission and wouldn't be swayed. Delia, now thoroughly taken aback by the sudden shift in her son's demeanor, blinked before replying. Of course Ash, what is it? The boy took a deep breath before beginning. As you guys know, I can't wait to start my own Pokémon journey in 5 years once I'm old enough. I've also been working hard at preparing myself for that time. Reading about Pokémon and studying about all the many different Pokémon types when I've been here at the lab. The two adults nodded, showing that they understood. Yes Ash, we know. Professor Oak crossed his arms and smiled. You really are taking this seriously, and I, for one, am proud of you for that. If only my grandson, or half of the other kids who come to me seeking their first Pokémon prepared beforehand like you are doing now, I dare say there would be many more trainers who would have far more success starting out. Delia also piped in. Yes, sweetie, I know how much this means to you and I am also very proud of how you are preparing for it. Ash just shook his and crossed his own arms. I appreciate that, really I do, but still, it's not enough. The other two appeared confused and looked at one another before Delia asked her son. What do you mean Ash? He sighed and sat back in his chair. The fact is, yeah, I may be studying hard and finding out more about Pokémon from watching them when Mom and I come here but still, the more I think about it, it's just not enough. At this point, with the knowledge I have currently, I could probably make a good start on my journey when it's finally time. But that just isn't good enough for me. He then sat forward and his eyes shone with fierce fire and will. I want to be the greatest Pokémon master that has ever lived and I can only do that if I train harder than everyone else. I want to take the world by storm. I don't want to make a good start and then fall in beside all of the other Pokémon trainers in the world and become just another good or even great trainer like Dad. Ash's fists clenched tightly. I want to conquer all of the Pokémon leagues. I want to defeat the Elite Four and champion of each region. I want to be known for being the best and most powerful Pokémon master there has ever been. I want to have a stronger bond with my Pokémon than any other trainer has ever had. I want to be known for having the strongest and most unique Pokémon in the world. He looked between his mother and the professor intently. But I can't achieve these things unless I train extremely hard and keep learning everything I can about Pokémon before I turn 10. Professor Oak and Delia were both shocked and amazed by what they were hearing. They knew he was passionate about his dream but not nearly that passionate. The professor took that time to speak on his thoughts. So what does this have to do with your mother and myself Mboy? Delia also looked at her son, wanting an answer, and he gave it while looking at the old man. Because Professor, you are the greatest Pokémon researcher in the world and you know countless amounts of information on Pokémon. Years worth of it. And Mom. He turned to his mother. You know so many things about proper nutrition, cooking, sewing, survival, you have medical knowledge and you know how to make Pokémon food. I know Dad taught you a lot of that stuff in the 2 years you were together before he left. The passionate boy looked between both of them in turn. I want you to please teach me everything you know about all of this stuff. Because of your experience with Pokémon, Professor, and your general knowledge about so many other things Mom, I know it will help me. If you do this, I will be prepared when the day comes for me to start my journey. So will you please do this for me Mom? Professor Oak. His mother and the professor looked at one another in complete awe. This 5-year-old boy was seeking to learn things that most adults would never have the patience or capacity to learn. They always knew that Ash was mature and intelligent for his age but what they were hearing now just seemed unreal. A child so young thinking so far ahead simply wasn't normal. The boy they knew had changed and they could see it. They both nodded at each other, coming to a silent decision, and then turned to face the boy. Professor Oak got up from his chair and went to stand in front of Ash, whom was also up and out of his chair now. The aged professional looked straight at the child and asked seriously. Are you sure this is what you want Ash? Ash nodded vigorously. Yes Professor, I am absolutely sure. Oak looked at him for a moment and then smiled when he saw the seriousness on the boy's face. All right then my boy, I will take you on as my unofficial assistant and between now and the time you turn 10, I will teach you as much as I can about Pokémon. Ash smiled widely hearing but then got a confused look on his face. Why an unofficial assistant professor? Why not official? Oak raised a finger into the air and explained. In order to become my official assistant, I would have to register you in the Pokémon Researcher International database. And you are simply too young for that right now. Oh okay, yeah makes sense. He replied understandingly. The professor had made his mind up though, so he clasped his hands behind his back. I tell you what though, Ash. If you succeed in learning under me for the next 5 years, which is something no one has ever done and is also the reason why I do not have an assistant, then I will give you something that could open a whole new door for you aside from just being a Pokémon trainer. Sound good to you? Ash's bright grin returned and he eagerly nodded. Yes sir, Professor. Oak chuckled at his enthusiasm and then Delia stepped up. Ash, she began, getting his attention. I am so proud of you for wanting to achieve your dreams so badly that you are willing to do anything to attain them. Your father would be so very proud of you. At that, Ash smiled again while Delia continued. I will make sure that I teach you everything you need to know about taking care of yourself and your Pokémon on your journey. I promise. Ash nodded and held up his fists. Thank you Mom, Professor Oak, this means a lot to me. I'll work hard, I promise. Both adults smiled and then Delia put her hands on her slender hips. Well Ash, let's head home then. It's getting dark and you have a big day ahead of you tomorrow. With that, Ash and his mother said their goodbyes to the professor before heading home. On the way, he couldn't help but think about what all his new training program would entail, and the prospect had him excited. Right as he and Delia were getting ready to walk in the front door of their house upon arriving home, Ash stopped and looked up at the sky that was now night and spoke to the stars quietly. Tomorrow, I begin taking the first steps on the road to beginning my destiny. Arceus, I hope you're watching me. I will make you proud. After he said that, he headed inside, never seeing the bright star that he had been looking at give a slight twinkle as if in response to his promise. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX He quickly reached back onto the small shelf behind his head and switched the Voltorb-shaped alarm clock off. Then, quick as could be, he climbed down the steps from his bunk, threw open the door to his closet that was built back into the bed and looked amongst his neat, orderly collection of things. Turning his attention to his clothes, he pulled out a gray sweatshirt and sweatpants and quickly slipped them on after shedding his nightwear. After going to the bathroom and getting ready for the day, he climbed out the second of the 2 windows in his room, which was the one beside his bed, and clambered up onto the top of the roof. There, he began running through many different upper and lower body stretches to warm himself up while he waited for the sun to come up. Once he saw the bright ball of light make its first appearance, he smiled outwardly and stopped stretching for a split second so that he could just admire the beautiful sunrise. He couldn't wait until he was on his journey and would then be able to see the sun arise from many different places every morning. After he was done watching the sunrise and finished stretching, Ash climbed back down to the overhang under his window, using his regular drain spout to do so, and then kept heading down using the same one until he was on the ground. Once his feet was on solid ground, he then ran to the front gate of the yard and made his out onto the main road in front of his house. Ash took the path to the right that lead away from Professor Oak's lab and wound in a circle around Pallet Town. He began jogging at a light pace down the road to warm his leg muscles up a little bit and then began increasing his pace. The whole point of his exercise program was to work his cardio, endurance, speed, agility, power and strength. He was going to work every muscle group as a whole throughout the course of each exercise, but he was also going to have targeted movements that focused on working each muscle group separately as well. He was going to make sure that with every exercise performed and with each different form of training he engaged in, he worked his cardiovascular system constantly. An increase in cardio would mean an increase in endurance and stamina all in one. Which, in the long run, would mean that Ash could run longer, faster, and be much better off if he suddenly had to take off running for any reason at all on his journey. Especially for long bursts. An increase in strength and power would be a great asset too, because if Ash had ever to lift his own, another person's or a Pokémon's body weight, he could do so much easier if his muscles were stronger. Stronger muscles would make everything much easier. Lifting, pushing, pulling, dragging, anything. Power would allow him to perform all of these feats much more explosively and with far more effectiveness than he could normally. Speed, agility and flexibility were very important as well. If one had proper training, then cardio, speed and agility could go hand in hand. Agility was good for many reasons. The more light on his toes Ash was, the more nimble he would be in getting away from threats quicker and thereby staying more safe. Flexibility was extremely important in case he was in a tight spot and needed to maneuver his way around in situations that could call for an increased range of motion. Speed coincided with cardio and agility. The faster Ash was on his feet would then be further improved by increased cardio, which would allow him to go longer without getting as tired. Agility worked with speed to increase reaction time, meaning that he would be able to make much faster and more effective decisions at a moment's notice. Ash had been reading books on fitness prior to his decision to begin his new routine. Some would call him a bookworm, and even though it took him a while the evening before, he felt certain that he had created a perfect exercise routine which he could follow 6 days a week. He would work his cardio every day as well as his flexibility. He would then alternate between strength training, speed training and agility training every other day. It would hit every focal point of fitness most crucial to his impending journey, and above all, it was something he needed to stick to ardently. Ash began picking up the pace a little more until he was soon at a full-on fast jog. Every 50 yards he would stop in a runner's crouch and then sprint as fast as he could for another 50 yards. Then, he would slow back down and continue his fast jog before repeating the process. He would also stop by the road every so often and then drop to the ground and do a variety of different push-ups, as well as different types of sit-up drills. After that, Ash would continue running his circle through Pallet Town while occasionally stopping off by a tree and doing pull-ups and chin-ups on low-hanging branches. Once Ash got back from his run, he entered the yard and then went out onto the lawn and began doing different types of aerobic and calisthenic exercises to work on toning his muscles. After 15 further minutes, he was done with his workout finally and began his cool down, which consisted of different breathing and stretching exercises. Finally, after 2.5 hours of intense exercising, the black-haired boy was done and then went inside to shower so that he could start working with his mother on everything that she had agreed to teach him. When Ash finally came downstairs from his shower about half an hour later, he was dressed in a pair of red cotton shorts and a black t-shirt. Coming into the kitchen, he found his mother already waiting for him. "Hello, student. Are you ready for your lessons?" she asked jokingly. Ash laughed at his mother's jest. "Yeah, Mom, I'm ready. Let's go." Delia nodded, having adjusted to her son's furthered and unusual increase in maturity even though it had been a little hard on her at first, and began working with him on the day's lessons. They went through how to cook different types of food that Ash could make easily on the road. He had explained to his mother that because of the new exercise program he was taking on, he would need to feed himself as balanced of a diet as possible while living on the road so that he could fuel himself with the proper nutrients needed to build his body. Ash knew from studying his books that he would need to have a diet consisting of even parts protein to build and keep his muscles strong, carbohydrates to give his body energy, and minimal amounts of fat. This was so that in a time of desperation or food deprivation, his body could burn the fat stores first as nourishment instead of his muscles. Luckily, his mother was able to teach him many cheap and affordable ways to find, purchase and prepare the food he would need, while also telling him what kinds to use that were travel-friendly. Namely, foods that would last a longer period of time and be easier to carry around on his journey. This was something that Ash was immensely grateful for as well, since, when the day finally came that he did set out on his travels as a new trainer, the words, affordable, and travel size, would always be his friend. Once that was finished, mother and son began going over how to cook different kinds of food for varying Pokémon types. This included specific recipes and meals that each individual Pokémon would need for all kinds of different training regimens. Ash's mother also taught him how to make Pokéblocks and Poffins, which were great for enhancing a Pokémon's appearance, vitality, strength, power and pretty much any other kind of enhancement to their attributes that a trainer could think of. The aforementioned Pokémon enhancers were also very popular in the Hoenn and Sinnoh regions, where Pokémon contests were most famously held. Pokémon coordinators would almost always use these vitamin-like supplements on their Pokémon before contests to make them more appealing in appearance and form to the judges. Ash, however, could think of many other uses that such enhancers could have on his own future Pokémon. Luckily, his mother told him that the ingredients for such things could usually be found at Pokémarts. Berries were the primary ingredients in both Pokéblocks and Poffins, and from what Delia said, the marts sold them too. Although, since different varieties of berries grew in the wilds of Kanto, Delia suggested he find as many as he could that way and thus, save himself money. Aside from that, the inquisitive boy had quite an interest in contests as well from everything he had seen online of them. Plus, whenever he managed to catch the Kanto Grand Festival on TV, it always held his attention firmly. In his mind, there was nothing stopping him from one day perhaps getting into Pokémon contests, and if that did indeed end up being the case, knowing how to make Pokéblocks and Poffins would be a must. After they were done in the kitchen for the day, Delia then took her child to the living room and worked with him on everything from sewing to medical training. The latter of which they practiced on dummies that she had borrowed from the local Pallet Town Health Center while Ash was out doing his morning workout. She also instructed him on survival tips and informed the aspiring trainer about everything he would need to use and carry with him on his journey to stay safe. Needless to say, by the end of the young Ketchum's learning session with his mother, his head was spinning from everything he had been taught. He couldn't have been happier though. Ash had learned a lot in only one day, and he still had 5 years of training to learn even more. That was also time in which he had to practice everything that he had already been taught. The entire morning they worked together though, Richard had been front and center in both of their minds. He had been the one, after all, who taught Delia everything she knew, aside from more general tasks like sewing. Being an experienced world traveler, he had taught her almost all the things she showed Ash. From making and preparing Pokémon food, vitamins and supplements to survival techniques and first aid. During the 2 years they were together before he left, Richard had showed Delia all about Pokémon nutrition so she could help him care for his Pokémon, both at home and at the lab. They had also camped together a few times, and it was on those trips that he taught her so many outdoor and safety skills. It was bittersweet to think about him, of course, but in some strange way, it was like having a piece of Richard home, and for the wife and son he had left behind, having even that was a small comfort. By the time Ash was done working with his mother, it was right at 10. So, after telling her goodbye, he left for Professor Oak's lab, excited for his training with the wizened and knowledgeable professor. As the young boy made his way to his next destination for learning, he broke out into a run so that he could get some more exercise, and before he knew it, he was at the front door of the Oak Laboratory. A few seconds after knocking on the door, Professor Oak himself opened it. "Good morning, Professor," Ash greeted cheerfully. After realizing who it was, the old professor smiled and returned the greeting. "Ash, my boy, you're here early. That's good, very good indeed, we can begin right away. Follow me." Ash obediently followed the professor into the lab without a moment of hesitation. Once inside and standing within the center of the ground research floor, Professor Oak turned to Ash. "Now, we are going to be learning many things today, Ash. First, we will go through some of my own research papers on Pokémon theory, type advantages and disadvantages, migratory patterns, breeding habits and behavior, as well as several other topics." He lifted a finger. "After that, we will go out into the fields and study the Pokémon firsthand. There, I will tell you all about the many secrets and techniques that I have learned over the years that you will be able to use for all of the many different Pokémon that you will encounter on your journey." He then crossed his hands behind his back. There are many, many things that I will teach you over the years, Ash, but they will all come in stages. Since this is the path you have chosen to walk but still need to complete your primary schoolwork, I will be taking over as your teacher from now on. As a certified researcher and Pokémon professor, I also have the authority to be your school teacher. The graying-haired man smiled down at his pupil. You would normally be starting school at the end of this summer, Ash, but I will be contacting the Pokémon League Academic Board tomorrow and informing them that you will essentially be getting homeschooled by me. Now, the minimum age that the league will let someone receive their first Pokémon here in Kanto as a certified trainer is at age 10. The professor placed his hands into his lab coat pockets. Many young people wait to receive their first Pokémon and become official trainers until they are between the ages of 12 and 13. Between these ages, primary school is over and you can then make the decision to either pursue a career of some kind with Pokémon, or go to university and specialize in something else. Some simply enter straight into the workforce. He gestured at the young boy before him. You, Ash, have decided on 10 being your starting point, the same as Gary. Like you, he will be studying hard to finish his primary schoolwork by the age of 10. Though, unlike you, he will be doing his in school while you do yours here with me. It will not be easy and we have much to cover in that time. We will even study through holiday and summer breaks. The enthusiastic child appeared very anxious and excited at the professor's in-depth lesson plan for him and nodded rapidly, utterly nonplussed by anything that was just said. All right, Professor. I'm ready to start training and learning everything you can teach me. I'll be the best student ever. Professor Oak grinned and ruffled his messy hair. I'm sure you will be my boy. Now let's get to work. Ash spent the rest of the day poring over many of Professor Oak's research papers, as well as books on practically every subject to do with Pokémon. He also looked up many different bits of information on individual Pokémon using the lab's Pokémon Database System, or PDS, for short. After that, at around 4 o'clock, he went out into the fields to watch and study the fighting-type Pokémon with Professor Oak. As the two of them made their way to the rocky plains of the ranch where the fighting-type Pokémon Professor Oak cared for loved to gather, he found several of them spread all throughout the rough, rugged training area as they sparred. Ash eventually sat down on a large rock nearby with the professor, a safe distance away, and pulled out his notebook. Soon, he began taking notes on the many different styles and techniques that the battle-loving Pokémon implemented whenever they fought. While he watched them fight and spar, he began to recall how Arceus told him that learning self-defense would greatly benefit him on his journey. The more he thought about it actually, the more he realized that there would be no one better to teach him how to fight than fighting-type Pokémon themselves. Mostly since even world champion human fighters couldn't so much as hope to match up to the might of a well-trained fighting Pokémon. Ash scanned the many fighting pros in the area, looking for the best fighting type of them all that would make the most suitable teacher for him. Eventually, he caught sight of 3, a Machamp, a Hitmonchan and a Hitmonlee. All 3 of them were fighting a group of 4 opponents each and showing the most amazing fighting prowess and techniques that the young boy had ever seen. He knew in that moment that he had found not one but possibly 3 teachers. After the 3 expert fighting types handily defeated their opponents, which was a mix of Primi, Machoke, Medicham, Hariyama and others, they went to start cooling down and Ash walked up to them. Of course, he told Professor Oak what he was doing beforehand. As he approached them, all 3 powerful Pokémon took notice and turned to face him. Once he had their attention, the fearless young boy spoke. Hey there, my name is Ash. I saw how you guys fought just now and that was incredible. I've never seen any fighting-type Pokémon with as much skill and raw power as you 3 have. You really are strong, no doubt. All 3 just raised their heads proudly and began flexing their muscles in reply. Ash though turned serious and then addressed them again. I actually wanted to ask you 3 a question. In 5 years' time, I'm going to be starting out on my own Pokémon journey. I'm gonna be spending all of my time until then training and preparing myself so I'm ready for it. He then raised and clenched his fists up by his chest. I'm going to become the greatest Pokémon trainer there has ever been one day, but in order to get there, I have to train hard. So what I want to know is, will you three please teach me how to fight and defend myself so I can be better protected on my journey? Please. The three fighting types blinked at him in surprise and then shared a look with each other as the trio thought over his request. Before long, they looked back at the boy and gave him a cool grin and a thumbs up, showing that they would indeed train him. Ash formed a huge grin on his face as he saw this and then began thanking them profusely. Wow, really? Thank you guys so much, I really appreciate this. I won't disappoint you, I promise. The three fighting Pokémon nodded and smiled a little at the young boy's fiery determination. After thanking them, the polite and eager child stepped back and held up a hand. How will training every day after I'm done with my lessons from Professor Oak work for you three? The fighting type professionals all grunted their approval and then Ash gave his own thumbs up. Awesome guys. Then I'll see you tomorrow, okay? The fighting experts nodded in understanding and he beamed another bright smile of gratitude at them before picking up his notebook, saying goodbye and then running back to the professor. Soon, he and the aged but still spry old man were walking back up to the lab as dusk started to fall. The whole way, Ash spoke a mile a minute and relayed to Professor Oak what had just happened. The amused researcher listened to the boy's story and commended him for searching out yet another skill set that would greatly help him on his eventual journey to come. Later, as Ash headed home that evening for one of his mother's delicious suppers, he could only keep thinking excitedly in his head. Everything is coming together perfectly. I'm gonna be so ready for my Pokémon journey when I'm finally old enough. Those were his thoughts the whole way back home. The only thing he knew for absolute certain was that the next 5 years were going to be exceedingly arduous and grueling, but it would get him one step closer to his dream, and that was all he cared about. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX at Professor Oak's laboratory, and nearly 10-year-old Ash Ketchum dodged under a kick thrown at him by Hitmonlee. He quickly jumped back and then did a front handspring, kicking Hitmonlee in the chest with surprising force and knocking him back. No sooner did the boy land on his feet though and punch was thrown right at his head. He quickly turned to the left just in time to dodge the fast-moving punch that was only seconds away from making contact with his face. The messy-haired young Ketchum stepped back into a regular fighting stance and then proceeded to block several lightning-fast punches that kept being thrown his way by Hitmonchan. Punch after punch the boxing Pokémon threw his way with grunts of its name each time. Hit, Mon, Chan Chan, Hit, Mon, Hitmon Mon. The punchy Pokémon was laser-focused on its target as it threw more punches at Ash's head and body. The agile boy, however, kept dodging, spinning and blocking each punch thrown his way with practiced ease as he continued to evade the fighting type's non-stop barrage of relentless attacks. Finally, he saw an opening and acted on it. Right as Hitmonchan lowered its guard on the right side to prepare for another punch, Ash stopped its left hook with an outside block and then wrapped his arm around the one belonging to the Pokémon he was fighting. Then, drawing Hitmonchan toward him by that same arm he had hold of, he stepped inside of the fighting type's guard. Moving like a striking Ekans from there, he threw an upward elbow that struck Hitmonchan under its chin and knocked it a little off balance. Ash then brought up both palms in a wide arc and slapped the punch-happy Pokémon on the sides of the head. While Hitmonchan was disoriented from the double head chop, he slid his left foot in between its legs and elbowed the fighting type directly in the stomach. While Hitmonchan was doubled over, Ash stepped swiftly behind it and delivered another elbow to its back. Right before his opponent fell to the ground, the skilled young boy brought a knee into its lowered face, knocking the punchy Pokémon into the air and sending it flying back a couple of feet where it soon landed painfully on the ground. Ash didn't relax though because at that same time he heard two thundering footsteps charging toward him. He turned just in time to see Machamp closing in on him as it brought one of its arms down in a fast karate chop. Professor Oak's pupil slid to the side just as his opponent's three other arms began swinging at him, each with a different fighting type move. Those being Mega Punch, Dynamic Punch and another karate chop. Ash swerved and weaved through every blow until Machamp finally stopped and brought two of its massive arms up above its head before just as quickly bringing them back down. The lithe and graceful trainer Hopeful jumped out of the way just in time to avoid the crushing double hammer fist, but Machamp wasn't done. From where its arms now were, buried in the ground, it strained hard and then finally, with a roar of effort, ripped a large chunk of earth out of the ground before hurling it at Ash. The boy jumped out of the way just in time and watched the speeding projectile zoom right by where he had been standing seconds before. In only a split second he saw, out of the corner of his eye, a foot come flying in at him at incredible speed. He turned from where he was standing and blocked Hitmonlee's powerful kick with his forearms. After being pushed back a bit from the force of the strong kick, Ash found himself blocking and dodging a barrage of lightning-fast kicks from the kicking fiend. Each one every bit as fast as Hitmonchan's own punches. The endangered 10-year-old kept dodging until he found himself backed up against a tree. Right as Hitmonlee was about to deliver the final kick, he stepped behind the tree and let the fierce Pokémon's kick make contact with the sturdy brown bark instead. The sheer power of the blow was enough that it knocked off large chunks of the flaky wood chips from the tree, and the sharp nails on the foot itself became lodged into its surface. In a millisecond, the cunning young boy grabbed Hitmonlee's foot that was still stuck in the bark and pulled it to the side hard so that the kicking Pokémon fell off balance and rammed its head into the tree. Ash used that time to grab onto a low-hanging branch and then swung both his legs up and around the tree hard. The result of this action was that it sent his feet slamming into the side of the fighting type's body with impressive force and sent it tumbling to the ground. Just as he dropped down from the branch, Ash felt 4 powerful arms slam around his body before picking him effortlessly up off of the ground and then crushing him in their hold. He managed to turn his head just enough to look behind him and saw Machamp with its arms wrapped tightly around him, squeezing him into submission. Ash, thinking quickly, threw his head back with force and smashed it into the muscular fighting type's face. The tactic worked and caused Machamp to stumble back a little bit, releasing its hold on Ash just enough for him to plant both feet on the Pokémon's thighs and then push up hard. Doing this allowed the boy to launch himself up into the air in a full, spinning turn until his right foot connected with Machamp's face. The sudden and painful hit was effective enough that it caused the 4-armed bruiser to totally release the boy and stumble back a few more steps. While the huge superpower Pokémon was still reeling from the kick, he slid in beside its legs and reached behind Machamp's right knee. Utilizing what he had both seen online, read in books and had been taught by his fighting-type coaches, Ash manipulated the pressure points behind the Pokémon's knee and did so quickly. The bulky brawler cried out in pain as Ash cut off the mobility in its leg from the knee down and then fell to the ground on the only good knee that remained. Machamp was still swinging its arms wildly, even while grounded, so the young boy moved quickly and ducked under a random swing. He then manipulated the pressure points just above Machamp's right arm, the second one up, leaving it too immobilized. He then jumped through the gap provided by the struggling fighting type's arms on the other side and quickly scurried around behind it. Now in perfect position, he reached up toward the multi-armed Pokémon and immobilized its top left arm via joint manipulation. Since Ash was already behind Machamp and it couldn't move due to its right knee being immobilized, he simply repeated the process on Machamp's lower arms while he had the chance. With the beefy, super strong Pokémon now completely unable to move and only having use of its right leg alone, Ash bowed in respect to his mentor and then jumped out of the way as a powerful fist connected with the ground where he once stood. As soon as Ash registered it was Hitmonchan, he heard a low drone of "Hitmon," and then looked up to see Hitmonlee hurtling down at him from on high with a flying knee. Due to good reflexes, he made his body move quickly and performed a back handspring to leap away just as Hitmonlee impacted the earth with a loud "Lee." The adrenaline-filled boy jumped back several steps from the 2 remaining fighting-type Pokémon and dropped into a wide fighting stance. His body was turned sideways to face them, one arm was up near his face and the other was dropped down to the side of his body. It was one of the many fighting stances and forms young Ash Ketchum had learned over the years from his fighting coaches. He squared off fearlessly with Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee as the 2 fighting types got back to their feet from the earlier failed assault attempts they had made against him. They each shared a single look and then, as if coming to a silent agreement, both of them began charging the boy at the same time. Ash took a deep breath and calmed his mind, rooting himself in his fighting stance but still remaining loose enough to move and react. The two fighting Pokémon were on him in the blink of an eye, punching and kicking at a rapid and well-timed pace. Their human target continued to block and dodge at swift speeds, but he knew that he wouldn't be able to keep it up for long and needed a plan. Suddenly, inspiration struck him. He moved out of the way of one of Hitmonchan's punches and then positioned himself while in mid-turn so that he was right in the middle of the two Pokémon. At the same time, just when Ash moved to stand in between the two fighting types and Hitmonchan's punch missed its mark, Hitmonlee's leg came around in a spinning roundhouse kick. However, the intelligent young man smirked and simply ducked smoothly under the kick. Since Ash was right in the middle of them, Hitmonlee's attack passed harmlessly over his head. The same could not be said, unfortunately, for poor Hitmonchan. With wide eyes, Hitmonlee kicked its partner square in the face with all of the power that was behind its mighty leg and sent the punchy Pokémon flying back through the air. Stunned and unable to save itself, Hitmonchan landed on the ground hard, several yards away, and grunted in pain. With Hitmonlee's leg still extended in the air and the kickboxer itself now temporarily frozen in shock after kicking its own teammate, Ash sprung into action. From where he was crouching on the ground, he brought his foot in and then kicked the inner thigh of the leg that Hitmonlee still had on the ground. The kick made contact and the power behind it immediately bruised Hitmonlee's inner thigh muscles, causing the unaware Pokémon to bellow in pain and then drop unceremoniously to the ground. Standing up quickly, Ash placed one foot on Hitmonlee's chest and pushed the Pokémon the rest of the way onto its back. Seeing the kicking fiend was unable to continue due to one of its legs now being completely out of commission for the remainder of the fight, Ash bowed to his other teacher and then turned to face Hitmonchan, whom was slowly getting back onto its feet. Since this was his last opponent, Ash knew to be extra careful and to not let his head or ego get in the way. He knew well enough now that only a calm and peacefully minded person would come out the victor in anything, so he calmed himself again with a few deep breaths and then focused back on Hitmonchan with determination burning in his amber eyes. He turned his body to the side so he was standing a shoulder width apart and brought both hands up into open palms in front of his body, one hand close to his chest and the other out in front of him, facing Hitmonchan. This was yet another fighting technique he had perfected over the last 5 years. Hitmonchan wasted no time and took off running at its human student at incredible speeds. Ash was ready for the dynamic Pokémon though and stood his ground. Hitmonchan closed the gap with a sliding right hook and Ash ducked under it. The fluid fighting type then followed up with a left uppercut that he jumped to the side to avoid. The powerfully punching Pokémon soon began rapidly punching at the boy with extremely fast blows. The accurate and strong fighting type may have been a little tired and bruised up, but it wasn't going to let that stop it from winning and avenging Hitmonlee and Machamp. Ash had already cooked up a plan to end the fight though and began leading Hitmonchan to a rock outcropping some ways off in the meadow, all while continuing to dodge the many punches being thrown at him. This was yet another time that he could be extremely thankful for his great conditioning, because otherwise, Ash knew he would have been winded and done in a long time ago. He and Hitmonlee finally reached the outcropping and then Ash let himself get backed up against two very large boulders that had a smaller one resting atop the crack that the two bigger rocks made. Ash got himself lined up perfectly with the crack and pushed back until he was totally flush against the split in the two boulders. Hitmonchan finally backed away from him and then began charging up a glowing fist. Ash knew that what he was seeing was one of his slug-loving coach's favorite moves, Mega Punch. As soon as it was ready, the fully focused fighting Pokémon reared back and then, with a loud and triumphant yell of, "Chan!" it brought the extremely powerful punch flying forward, directly at Ash's face. Seconds before the hit could connect though, he ducked his head down a little and the punch smashed into the crack that the two boulders formed. The small crack itself soon became a huge chasm between the two boulders after Hitmonchan's Mega Punch blasted through it like a jackhammer. Ash knew what was about to happen next, being that it was all a part of his plan, and then smirked again before rolling away to the side of a very confused Hitmonchan. He just stood there beside of Hitmonchan after that, calmly, and waited for Phase 2 of his master plan to take effect. Sure enough, the predictable fighting type didn't disappoint and began withdrawing its gloved hand from between both large boulders. However, as the punchy Pokémon started pulling its hand out, the smaller boulder that was resting on top of the two bigger ones came totally loose and fell straight down until it collided with Hitmonchan's arm. This, by extension, pinned the unsuspecting Pokémons down onto the ground. Hitmonchan's eyes went wide as it tried to free its arm, but it was all in vain. While the trapped Pokémon tried getting free, Ash set a serious look upon his face and cracked his neck. He then resumed a simple fighting stance and moved in close to Hitmonchan with his legs a little wider than shoulder width. Settling into what Ash dubbed his power stance, he brought his guards up and then began raining multiple straight jabs, power punches, hooks and uppercuts into Hitmonchan's body. The blows weren't intended to maim and mutilate, but they were designed to sting and to force one's opponent into submission. The defenseless fighting type gasped and grunted from the barrage of punches that it was being pelted relentlessly with until, finally, Hitmonchan could take no more and dropped to its knees in surrender. Seeing that he was victorious, Ash immediately stopped his assault and then knelt down to push the rock off of Hitmonchan's arm. After doing that, he stood back up and bowed to his teacher, which the impressed Pokémon returned after getting back to its own feet. Seeing that his fighting coach was still a little sore, he offered his left arm to Hitmonchan, whom smiled in gratitude and then slung its right one over Ash's shoulder. Supporting one of the few individuals that had helped make him into who he was now, the respectful young man helped his teacher walk back to the center of the clearing where the other two fighting Pokémon were. After they returned to the area in question, Ash was surprised to see Professor Oak already there and tending to Machamp and Hitmonlee's wounds, welts and bruises. It had been a rather long sparring bout after all, and even the chosen of Arceus had a few tender places on his own body from prior hits taken that he imagined would take a while to heal up. When the kindly old professor saw his pupil walking up wearing gray sweatpants and a matching, ripped-up t-shirt with an exhausted-looking Hitmonchan limping beside him, the famous researcher chuckled and shook his head. "Ash, my boy, I take it you had a good training session with your coaches." The son of Richard Ketchum smiled at the kind-hearted professor and nodded. "Sure did, Professor. Since today was the last day of training that I'll be having with you, Mom and the three of them, I really wanted to test myself and see just how far I've come in the last 5 years. I mean, my journey finally starts tomorrow. I'm turning 10 and that means I can finally get my first Pokémon." Professor Oak took one look at the beat-up and exhausted fighting types and shook his head in amazement. His surrogate grandson never ceased to amaze him. He still remembered how Ash had said 5 years ago that he was going to receive defensive training from 3 fighting types right there on the ranch. Yet, it was not just any fighting Pokémon either, but Machamp, Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan of all candidates. Those particular 3 fighting types were easily the strongest of any that resided on the ranch. He and Delia had both thought it a good idea for Ash to learn self-defense before he went on his journey. Thus, they were very supportive of him learning from 3 master fighting types. After all, neither of them knew what Ash would encounter on the road, and because of that very reason, they wanted him to be as prepared as possible. After 5 years of training with 3 such powerhouse Pokémon, Samuel Oak had no doubts in his mind that Ash had indeed learned a lot. However, when the bold young boy told he and Delia the day before that he was planning on actually fighting his coaches in a full-on, 3-on-1, no-holds-bar fight, both of them became more than a little worried and concerned for him. It was then that he told Ash about the history of his 3 coaches. Their trainers were all world champion fighters that had trained Machamp, Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan to also be great fighters. However, since they were Pokémon and fighting types at that, they were naturally extremely gifted and eventually became better fighters, far better fighters, than even their own world champion trainers. Naturally, he and Delia had been worried for Ash, especially if it really was going to be an all-out brawl. The extremist young man, unfortunately, had said that it was something he needed to do to test himself before his journey started in 2 days' time so that he could know whether he was ready or not. They didn't want to let him, but both he and the boy's mother knew that once Ash's mind was made up, there was no stopping him. Even still, while Oak was greatly relieved that his pupil was okay, he was no less astounded that Ash had actually been victorious in such a bout. It seemed impossible, but yet, the proof was sitting before him, covered in bruises or suffering from some kind of battle-related pain. Of course, Ash had been tested by both Delia and himself on everything that they had taught him in the last 5 years. And when they did, they were shocked at the results. In the few years since Ash had started his training, he quickly became very adept at several skill sets. He could proficiently sew his own clothes, he had an impressive grasp on survival and medical tactics, and he had turned into a very fine cook of both human and Pokémon food. He was also quite accomplished at making many different types of Pokéblocks and Poffins. Yet, those were only the talents he had picked up through Delia's mentorship. The worldly old professor could honestly say that when it came to Pokémon, the boy was a through-and-through genius. Ash had learned almost everything that he could teach him in just 5 years. Every subject on Pokémon imaginable the boy was a natural at. That included taking care of the Pokémon in the ranch. As impossible as it sounded, the professor would have even ventured to say that many of the ranch Pokémon loved Ash almost as much as their own trainers. Not as much, obviously, but close. When he couldn't teach him anything else, which happened about a year ago, Ash began doing his own research on Pokémon. At the current point he was at, Delia's son was a walking Pokédex when it came to being able to rattle off almost anything about Pokémon. No matter what type, what kind, what region, it truly didn't matter. It almost seemed as though young Ash Ketchum had a photographic memory for the things he read and learned. There was simply no other explanation for it. In all actuality, the only reason that Oak believed Ash would usually need a Pokédex is to be officially recognized as a registered Pokémon trainer and to be able to enter into things like the Pokémon League gym challenges, conferences, and any other official Pokémon event. Or if he came across an exceedingly rare or unique Pokémon. Of course, he also needed one to obtain information on what gender a wild Pokémon was and also what ability it possessed, since no amount of knowledge could preemptively tell a person that. Ash was also, on his journey, going to be endeavoring to fill his Pokédex with as many entries on Pokémon as he could. That was mostly being done for the professor himself, though, to assist in his own research. Truth be told, if he was honest with himself, Samuel Oak was just a little bit jealous of the boy. To know such an incredibly large amount about Pokémon and to be such a prodigy at such a young age, well, it would be hard not to be jealous. Still though, he was very proud of his student and wished on more than one occasion that his own grandson would be so dedicated. Not to say that his biological grandchild wasn't going to be successful or that he was stupid, not at all. Gary was intelligent and he was going to make a very capable Pokémon trainer in his own right. But even still, if Ash was anything on his actual journey with his own Pokémon like he was at the lab, the sky would be the limit for him in a way that Gary could well never achieve. When the young prodigy was working or interacting with the Pokémon out in the ranch, he showed the true depth of his budding prowess. Even though none of them belonged to Ash and he was not their trainer, few would believe it. They obeyed him so well that they would even engage in mock battles with one another just to help get Ash a little hands-on experience with actual battling. If that in of itself was any indicator of the boy's potential, then he was going places. Big places. To top it all off, Ash not only had made a point to show how well-rounded he was in his skill sets and just how adept he quickly became at anything he was shown, he had also proven far more. He had shown that he was not just very intelligent and very committed to anything he attempted, he also excelled at physical tasks as well. Needless to say, after seeing how the young man had not only fought but defeated 3 world-class fighting-type powerhouses, the astute and observant Pokémon professor knew that he had no reason to fret over Ash's safety when he finally started his journey. Especially not once he got a good, strong, loyal team of Pokémon on his side. Which also lead the curious professor to wonder just what Pokémon that Ash would choose for his starter. Unlike every other prospective trainer, Even Gary, he had not yet expressed any interest at all in divulging which one he was going to choose. Not even the smallest inkling. The pensive Pokémon researcher was suddenly broken from his thoughts by Ash himself as he tried to get his attention. "Professor. Hey Professor, are you there?" The older man shook his head and then smiled as he looked down at his pupil. "Sorry about that, boy, I was just thinking. Did you want to ask me something?" The only child of the Ketchum sat Hitmonchan down beside the other two Pokémon, who were resting from the intense spar they just had, before speaking. "I was wondering if you would mind returning these guys before you head back up to the lab. They need a nice long rest under the PRM and I'd do it myself, but it's getting late and I need to head home. I still need to get cleaned up, eat and then go to bed early enough so I can be fully rested for tomorrow. Would you mind, Professor?" The grandfather of Daisy and Gary Oak just shook his head and then waved the question off dismissively. "Not at all, not at all. I'm just glad to see you're thinking ahead as usual. I'll take care of these three and by morning they'll be good as new." Ash smiled at his mentor. "Thanks, Professor, I really appreciate it." He smiled and stowed his hands into his lab coat pockets, a rather common habit for him. "Not a problem, Ash. Now go home and get some rest." He nodded at the professor's suggestion and then turned back to his fight coaches of the last 5 years. "Hey guys, I just wanted to thank you again for everything that you've done for me these last 5 years. Without you three, I wouldn't be nearly as prepared as I am now because of all the rough training you put me through." And that was true. Over the recent 5 years Ash had grown very athletic. He had increased his morning workout intensity tenfold, running not just the circle of Pallet Town but also even further than that. He now ran about 8 to 10 miles a day. His aerobic and calisthenic workouts increased in time from 10 to 15 minutes 5 years ago to a full hour now. He could do around 50 push-ups, the same number of frontal abdominal and oblique crunches and 30 full sit-ups of the same abdominal muscle groups. He could also now do around 12 pull-ups and 16 chin-ups, and that was purely because his fighting coaches taught him all about how to really train and get down to business. They drilled him into the dirt on everything he did for 5 years. Cardio, endurance, stamina, speed, strength, agility, if it could be improved upon, they made him drill on it. That was a very fortunate thing too, because before they started taking over his exercise regimen, Ash considered for a time that he might have needed to join the local gym in Pallet that his mother, Aunt Amelia, and her daughter Daisy, when she was home at least, had started going to shortly after he first met Arceus. While both women were in great shape and jogged together on a regular basis, the two of them had wanted to mix up their routine somewhat and also take on a more integrated workout program. The local gym allowed them to use cardio machines, free weights, guided weight machines, and the facility also offered a variety of fitness classes, which they regularly took. Ash himself thought that he would have to ask his mother to sign him onto her membership as a guest so he could get in as well, being too young for his own, but once his fighting coaches came along, any thoughts he had about adding something extra went right out the window. Their training had almost killed him more than once and he wasn't too proud to admit it. Needless to say, now that the 5-year training session was up, Ash wasn't just smart, capable with his hands and knew how to fight. Along with many other things, he was also fit and felt completely ready for his journey. He didn't feel a bit of nervousness for it anymore like he did when he was 5. Ash was ready now, and he felt certain that Arceus herself would agree with him on that as well. But, even still, he was not arrogant enough to think that he did it all on his own. He knew that if it hadn't been for his mother, Professor Oak, and his coaches, he wouldn't be even half of what he was now. Someone who was confident, prepared, ready to confront the world and also face his destiny. He knew exactly who he had to thank for becoming the person he now was, and that also proved that the boy had humility. The 3 fighting Pokémon finally rose up, and when they did, they looked at the young boy they had helped train and sized him up. Then, one by one, each of them placed their hands on his shoulders, even Machamp's extra ones, and nodded to him, demonstrating that they were proud of him and that he had earned their respect. Ash smiled at their gesture and then bowed low to each of them in turn. It was a sign of gratitude for all they had taught him and also as a farewell in case he didn't see them again before he left on his journey. They too bowed in a similar manner, with the same intentions behind it, and then he turned to Professor Oak afterward. "Thank you for taking care of them, Professor. I'll talk to you tomorrow morning." Before the older man could reply, the enthusiastic young boy was already running out of the meadow and back toward the fields so he could get home before it got dark. He waved behind his head as he ran and Professor Oak merely chuckled fondly at the child's endless supply of energy. As he disappeared through the trees, old Sam reminisced on his own youth for just a moment as he looked up at the now orange sky above and closed his eyes. For a time he just stood there and felt the warm, early summer air blow across his face and through his graying hair while he remembered times long past from a life well lived. Eventually though, his moment of recollection ended and he finally came back to the present. Soon thereafter he returned the 3 fighting Pokémon into their Pokéballs, which he had brought with him, before making his way through the meadow and back to the fields that lead to the lab. Albeit, at a much slower pace than Ash had. Along the way, he silently wondered on whether or not the young boy would like his birthday present the next day. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX darkness of night was gradually descending over the valley that Pallet Town resided within. Once he had made it to the gateway at the bottom of the steps that descended down the hill, the boy passed through it and then, after shutting the gate back, he ran over the small bridge. It was the same bridge that connected the one end of the small river that ran in front of Oak's lab to the other. As soon as he made it to the other side, Ash steadied his pace and began evenly trotting down the wide dirt road that led away from Professor Oak's lab and curved down through the grassy plains of his hometown. Along the way, he turned his head this way and that and looked at all of the houses dotted here and there across the landscape. Since it was evening, he could see lights just starting to turn on as the inhabitants within prepared to settle down for a relaxing night at home. Eating supper, watching TV and enjoying family time for those fortunate enough to have one. Though, since Pallet Town was a family-friendly community, almost every house had one. Looking up at the mostly clear sky above then, which had only a few clouds freckled here and there that were just starting to turn dark as the black curtain of night descended, Ash smiled. The calm young man wore such a smile because the evening was beautiful and the warm breeze he could feel blowing through his hair felt superb. It also drifted the sense of summer toward his nose, those being mostly the smells of freshly clipped grass, flower gardens and the mingled sense of food that was now coming through several of the nearby homes that had their windows open. As he ran on his way though, the boy's mind gradually started to drift into thought. When it did, he found himself reflecting on everything he had learned over the last 5 years and just how far he'd come in that time. His mother and Professor Oak had been amazing teachers and indeed taught him many, many crucial things that he knew would greatly aid him on his travels. His fighting coaches could lay claim to the same credit in their own way. However, as he pondered over such things, Ash once more began contemplating on something that he frequently found himself postulating deeply over. He wasn't arrogant or conceited, far from it. In fact, the thoughtful young man tried to make it a point to ensure that humility was one of the things he instilled into himself more than any other quality. Of course, his mother and Professor Oak were no shirkers when it came to hammering such qualities into him either. Regularly. Even though he knew that he wasn't arrogant, the astute young boy still had enough self-awareness to notice how easily he seemed to learn new things. Regardless of what it was, he always seemed to have an easier time learning and quickly becoming proficient at things he did than other children his age. Ash knew that he had always been a book-loving, intelligent person that highly valued learning new things. It was a sharp contrast to his more excitable, energetic and at times, reckless, outward nature. Like two polar opposites of a spectrum that existed simultaneously within him. However, even still, intelligence didn't explain away how easily he seemed to pick up on new things. Oftentimes, he could simply look at something and then possess an innate knowledge of how to quickly become skillful at whatever it was. He knew that there were very intelligent people in the world, far more intelligent than him even. People that were tried and true geniuses in every way, which he knew that he himself most certainly was not. Unfortunately, it still didn't do anything to answer the questions he had as to why he was how he was. It wasn't just his ability to pick up something new and become skilled at it rather quickly either. Specifically, nowadays especially, it had far more to do with his physical prowess. Even though he knew that his last 5 years of training had gone a long way in increasing his overall fitness and physical capability, Ash lived under no deluded fantasies of reality. He was fully aware that he was still just a 10-year-old kid, and he also knew that because of that, he had limits. Many of them, in fact. As a child, he was fully willing to accept the fact that he should have had several physical limitations. No matter how hard he worked out, he was still a 10-year-old with a 10-year-old's body. Sure, he may have been in shape, but he was no hulking muscle man, and he knew that. He was thin and had lean muscle for his age, but that was it. However, even knowing and accepting such things did absolutely nothing to explain how he was able to perform some of the incredible physical feats that he had demonstrated recently. Chief among these was his recent spar with Machamp, Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan. No matter how in shape he was or how skilled he had become in the art of self-defense over the last few years, Ash knew that he realistically should have stood no chance against such powerful experts of the fighting arts. Not only were his coaches in possession of many years' worth of combat experience that far exceeded his own, they were Pokémon as well. And not just that, but fully evolved, well-trained, world champion level fighting types who had power at their disposal equal to a fully loaded dump truck speeding down an empty highway. Even though he had challenged them to a spar the day before, Ash never had any expectations of actually beating them or even lasting all that long. He mostly wanted to do it as a test of how far his fighting skills had come. To be honest, he had been a little nervous before the match itself. He knew that his coaches wouldn't do anything to kill him or seriously injure him, but going up against 3 fighting-type champs like them had still left him feeling trepidatious. It was upon taking all of this in together that caused him to be so stunned when the fight began and he actually held his own. Not only that, but as the spar progressed and he gradually gained ground on them, his own expectations had been proven woefully inaccurate. Ash really couldn't explain how, why or in what way the fight had went how it did. He knew that his coaches weren't playing with him either, since he specifically had requested they fight him seriously. And from the power he felt behind their blows, he knew they were. If his life were a story and someone were to read it and go over his fight against the 3 fighting-type powerhouses, he wouldn't blame them for crying foul at the end. He himself was still trying to keep from doing the same, and he had been in the fight. Logically, he knew that there was no way a 10-year-old child should have been able to hold his own against, let alone defeat, such powerful Pokémon in a fist-to-fist confrontation. They were far stronger, faster and overall physically superior to a weak human like him by comparison. If that same reader of his story would call his recent defeat of his coaches utterly impossible and ridiculous, he would totally agree. No matter how many times he went over the fight in his head, he still couldn't process how any of it had happened. From the time the fight began, it was almost as if he was able to feel another presence come over him. Even though it was him fighting and he could perfectly recall every detail, it was like he wasn't in full control of his body. It was like feeling a massive surge of energy and power rushing into him from the moment the fight started. Not only that, but as the battle had progressed, he felt himself become even stronger with each passing minute. His body felt light, quick and agile, far beyond what he was capable of now. His strength, power, reaction time, maneuverability and even his senses had all seemed to heighten to levels far beyond normal. As fast as his coaches had moved, his eyes were able to track their movements. As hard as their blows were, he had been able to successfully block them with his own body without getting broken like a toothpick as he should have been. When he went back over the fight in his head, he could recall feeling some kind of powerful, raw energy rising up inside of him and surging through his veins. Empowering every muscle, reinforcing every bone and energizing every cell of his being. It was like some part deep within him had come alive and gave him access to a power he had never before known. This essence, this presence, this energy within was what had given him the ability to do the impossible. He didn't know how, and it made him feel crazy to think it, but Ash swore that the mysterious force within him was what had allowed him to overcome 3 such vastly superior opponents. And in a fight that he should have otherwise been crushed in, easily so. In many ways, he wondered if that same presence or force inside of him was what also allowed him to learn and become proficient at things so quickly. In its own way, he oftentimes felt that some other part of his brain took over whenever he was undertaking any kind of new task. When he thought about such things though, it only ever ended up leaving him with more questions than answers. Such is just what the mysterious force inside of him was, where it came from, what it actually made him as a human being, and, most importantly, if it came from Arceus. Namely, if it was tied to the whole, chosen one, thing she had revealed to him years prior. Which, if he was honest with himself, was a subject he didn't ponder on often simply because he had absolutely nothing to go on except for the little Arceus had told him. Either way, the many questions he had on his mind would have to wait for a hopeful explanation at a later time, since he soon found himself arriving at his house. Running through the gate into the yard, Ash jogged up to the door and then ran inside while calling out, "Mom, I'm home." As he removed his black cross trainers, which looked quite the bit worn after 2 years of constant wear, he saw his mother's head appear from the kitchen. Seeing him, she smiled and came fully into view while wiping her hands on a dishcloth. "Hi honey. Why don't you go get cleaned up and then we'll have supper? You're just in time. We're having carp fillets, mashed potatoes, steamed spinach and rice tonight." His stomach growling to remind him of how hungry he was, Ash waved to her and moved his shoes out of the way. "Right, I'll go clean up now." He then hurried off upstairs to shower, and after he was finished, he came back downstairs dressed in a black t-shirt and green shorts. Joining his mother in the kitchen, whom already had the table set and food laid out, his mouth practically salivated before he quickly sat himself in his chair and started to eat. While he and his beautiful, physically fit mother enjoyed their quiet evening at home, they made small talk about the day's events and everything that had occurred. However, when asked about his spar with the 3 fighting types earlier at the ranch, he shrugged nonchalantly and said that it had went well. Specifically speaking, he made it a point to assure his mother that he didn't get hurt, though his body was still a little tender in certain places, and that his coaches hadn't been too hard on him. The main reason he told her the story he did and neglected to divulge how the fight really went was because he didn't want her fretting over him. Also, he still didn't know how to explain his stunning victory over Machamp, Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan. It still baffled his own mind, and therefore, explaining it to his mother would have been a difficult task, to say the least. Luckily, his answer seemed to satisfy her curiosity, and shortly after supper was over, while they were cleaning up together, she snapped her fingers and looked at her child. "Oh, that reminds me, sweetie. I got everything together that you'll need for tomorrow and put it all up in your room. There's a surprise or 2 waiting for you up there too, so hopefully you'll like it." She finished with a wink, and he smiled in gratitude at her. "Wow Mom, thanks. I'll be sure to check it out after I finish watching the Indigo Conference finals tonight." After that, Ash finished helping his mother clean up in the kitchen, and then, upon hugging and telling her good night, he went upstairs to retire for the evening. Once his teeth were brushed and his face was washed, the young trainer-to-be went to his room and sat down at his desk near one of the windows where his small flat screen was located. After turning it on, he found that the Indigo Conference finals on the League channel were already well underway. The match was between a young woman named Nisha and a man of similar age whose name was Corey. The woman had dark purple, almost violet hair and green eyes. She was wearing a light purple, sleeveless shirt with darker coloring of the same kind down both sides and a white collar that was flipped up at the top. She also wore a pokeball around her neck and had her lower body covered by yellow pants and light brown shoes. Her left wrist was donned in a white band. The young man, Corey, had messy dark blue hair and dark eyes. He was wearing a light orange tracksuit with red trimming down the center, around the waist and also down the legs. The tracksuit, on the left side of the chest over the heart, had a strange, circular yellow design on it, and even more unusual, his Pokeballs were kept strapped to both sides of his legs by, most likely, hooks. His feet were covered in blue and black cross trainers. As Ash intently watched the program on his TV, he saw that the Indigo Stadium was packed from floor to ceiling with people. Cameras were everywhere, and from the large digital screen up near the glass dome of the roof, directly above the battlefield, it showed they were both already down to their last 2 Pokémon each. The current battle was between Corey's Gengar and Nisha's Nidorino, and as the fight waged on, Ash turned up the volume and got even closer so his observant eyes could catch every minute. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX dirt-covered ground of the stadium floor in order to evade the barrage of shadow balls that Gengar was unleashing at it. Making use of impressive speed and evasion skills, the poison type was able to dodge and avoid each ball of ghoulish energy that went zipping its way. Jumping, swerving, ducking, weaving and sliding, Nidorino showed that it wouldn't be an easy target to hit as it continued to evade all of its fully evolved opponent's attacks. Finally, after making a straight charge for Gengar while feinting from side to side to avoid the shadow ball barrage, Nidorino suddenly jumped up into the air and, from its horn, came a burst of glowing needles. Utilizing Poison Sting, which wouldn't have been overly effective anyway, Nisha's Pokémon tried to stall for time, and it worked too, since Gengar, whom was floating above the field, had to move quickly to the side to avoid the rain of sharp needles. Nidorino showed that it was only a diversion though, since, after landing, it started charging toward Gengar again while Nisha yelled, "Use focus energy and then drill run." Making a powerful leap up into the air while its body began glowing red, Nidorino flipped itself in midair and then went hurtling down at Gengar with a growl. At the same time, the pink-skinned Pokémon rotated itself in the air and began spinning like an automatic drill with its horn pointed straight at Gengar. Corey, however, quickly called out, "Gengar, use Nightshade." The grinning dual-type Pokémon showed no fear as it simply floated back and then, from its eyes, fired twin beams of powerful, ghastly red-looking ghost-type energy at Nidorino. The counterattack caught the spinning Pokémon off guard, and as soon as the beams hit, they caused it to become suspended in the air while inflicting painful-looking damage on the trapped Nidorino. Then, on the heels of that, he yelled again, "Now use Shadow Ball." While it used its former attack, Gengar formed yet another ball of wickedly dark energy in its hands, which it quickly launched at its opponent. Nidorino was in no fit state to dodge and thereby took the attack head-on. From the cloud of smoke that shot up after the impact, Nidorino dropped out of the air and landed on the ground. It didn't get back up, showing that it had been defeated. "Oh, and Nisha's Nidorino is down after a long fight, folks," the announcer narrating the match called out through the intercom system. "Who will she choose next?" Nisha, too experienced and in the moment to let the loss get to her, quickly thanked her Pokémon and returned the unconscious Nidorino while the crowd went wild. On the heels of returning the now shrunken ball back to the stylish yellow belt she kept around her waist, the violet-haired woman quickly picked her last Pokémon and brought it out with no time to spare. From the red and white ball erupted a bright flash of white and blue energy that materialized into the hulking form of a Blastoise. The large, bulky water Pokémon raised itself into the air and announced its appearance with a loud blast. "It looks like she has chosen her Blastoise as her final Pokémon. Let's see if they can turn the tide," came the announcer's exuberant observation again. The battle resumed as soon as Nisha's Pokémon took the field, with Corey yelling for Gengar to use Confuse Ray. This his Pokémon did and sent pulsating, glowing rings of yellow energy floating rapidly toward Blastoise. However, nonplussed, Nisha ordered her heavily defended water type to use Flash Cannon. The two cannons on its back pointed forward and started to charge up the steel-type attack before, in only seconds, double beams of bright silver energy erupted from them and soared through the air. They easily tore through the rings of confusion-inducing energy and continued on toward Gengar. The ghost poison type was lucky enough to float away out of range of the attack and then, on Corey's command, used Dark Pulse as a retaliation. The creepily grinning Pokémon's eyes sent dozens of dark, pulsing energy bursts at the starter Pokémon of Kanto, but Nisha had her last Pokémon use Withdraw to defend. Blastoise luckily pulled itself into its shell in just enough time to avoid taking the brunt of the Dark-type attack, and instead, the energy blasts impacted the thick shell of the sturdy turtle, which thereby inflicted damage, though not as much as it would have been otherwise. Blastoise quickly came back out of its shell seconds later, since Nisha shouted for it to use Ice Beam as a rapid counter to Gengar's last attack. Before Corey or his own Pokémon could react, a chillingly cold beam of Ice-type energy was launched from Blastoise's mouth and zoomed through the air. Then, with no time to defend, Gengar was struck by the beam of freezing energy and quickly became encased in a block of thick ice. As the now frozen Ghost-type dropped to the ground, Corey frowned when he saw his incapacitated Pokémon land on the battlefield with a loud thud. Knowing Gengar was defeated since he was trapped in the block of ice, he returned the encapsulated ghoul and then, like Nisha, was resorted to his last Pokémon. Corey is now down to his last Pokémon as well. This should be exciting, folks. The now electrified crowd didn't have to wait long for his next and last selection, however, since Corey's final Pokémon proved to be the perfect counterpart to Blastoise, a Venusaur. "Oh, would you look at that?" the announcer yelled as Venusaur appeared and looked ready for battle. "The end of this match looks like it will come down to an all-out brawl between Blastoise and Venusaur." What a match indeed. The two fully evolved juggernauts stared each other down for a short time until Corey ordered Venusaur to use Leaf Storm. Even as the four-legged grass type brought forth the veritable storm of leaves that surged across the battlefield toward Blastoise, Nisha ordering it to use Rapid Spin made all the difference. Namely, when the shellfish Pokémon tucked itself into its shell and went spinning through the air, rapidly, across the field, it was also able to tear straight through the vortex of leaves like they were made of paper. Blastoise ended its lightning-fast spin by slamming itself straight into Venusaur and knocking the other Pokémon back several feet. Then, coming out of its shell, the female trainer's last Pokémon used Hydro Pump. The close-up distance between the two ensured that the double jets of highly condensed water slammed into Venusaur point-blank. The resultant effect of said attack pushed the grass type back even further, leaving deep ruts in the ground in the process. However, Corey was quick on the spin and waved his hand. Brutaroot used Petal Blizzard. From where the dual grass poison type was now standing firmly rooted, hundreds of glowing pink petals emerged from out of the flower on its back and started to surround Venusaur in a furiously spinning vortex of beautiful but deadly floral shurikens. Shellshocker use Iron Defense. Nisha urgently yelled out the nickname she had given her first Pokémon just before Venusaur could launch its attack. Her Pokémon dropped to the ground and raised its shell up as it took on a bright, gleaming sheen of silver. This occurred just as the pink hurricane of petals was unleashed at Blastoise and slammed into it with force great enough to push it back for several feet. Grimacing against the extremely effective attack while doing its best to defend, the final evolved form of Squirtle weathered out the leafy storm as the hundreds of petals rained down upon its hard shell. Taking advantage of the distraction, Corey yelled, "Now use Double Edge." Venusaur growled its name gruffly and then took off at its opponent while glowing with a yellow light. Then, taking advantage of Blastoise's distraction, Venusaur charged through its own storm of petals and slammed its glowing body into the front of the water-type's shelled torso. The powerful intensity of the hit sent Blastoise careening away and actually caused it to go to one knee for a second. It had barely managed to stabilize its footing without falling over. The powerful and numerous onslaught of sharp pink petals had still inflicted quite the bit of damage, even though Blastoise had used Iron Defense. Double Edge only compounded onto that. Seeing Venusaur now charging up energy into the top of the flower that was on its back, Blastoise and Nisha both knew what was coming. Therefore, she told her own Pokémon to use Hydro Cannon. A few seconds later, with both rivals now standing almost the entire distance of the field apart from one another, Venusaur raised up for just a moment and then slammed itself back to the ground while roaring, "Venus R!" From the flower on its back came a huge beam of pure solar energy, Solar Beam, while Blastoise likewise unleashed its own hyper-powerful attack. Lowering itself to the ground, the cannons on the large turtle's back shook for a moment before expelling two incredibly powerful, high-pressure eruptions of water from them that merged into one colossal jet of aquatic fury. The attacks of opposing natures collided in the center of the field and battled for dominance for a span of several unending moments. Finally though, when the climax could be no greater, they exploded and bathed the field in smoke and a rain of water droplets. The action that had fully enraptured the entire massive audience was only stagnant for a short time though. Even in the screen of thick smoke, the sounds of grunting and fighting could be heard, and when the cloud at last lifted, it revealed Blastoise and Venusaur standing in the center of the ring while they physically dueled and strove for supremacy. The former had its arms pushing against Venusaur's body while the latter's head was doing the same as it dug into Blastoise's protected torso. The two powerful Pokémon refused to give even an inch to the other as they fought and struggled for dominance in their battle of wills. Finally, it was their trainers who broke the stalemate when Nisha and Corey respectively commanded Blastoise to use Water Pulse and Venusaur to use Razor Leaf. The two attacks were not overly powerful, but it was still enough to break up the grappling match and force them apart. The blast of water that hit Venusaur in the face caused it to stumble back, while the dozens of sharp leaves fired at Blastoise caused it to tumble away from the grass type as well. At last, with both Pokémon showing signs of fatigue and having sustained a few hits that left its mark, their trainers knew it was all or nothing time. Thus, Nisha and Corey both reached into their pockets at the same time. Soon, the two battling finalists pulled out what looked like bracelets, Corey's being black and Nisha's purple. Though what really caught the attention of the audience were the small, uniquely colored stones set into both bracelets. Each one with its own individual design emblazoned upon the stones. Then, simultaneously, the two of them raised their wrists up, crossed them, and touched the stones on the bracelets with their hands. Shortly afterwards, the small stones erupted in an explosion of multicolored light, and the energy released from those stones traveled in an arcing motion towards each trainer's Pokémon. As soon as the energy reached Blastoise and Venusaur that was coming from the stones both of their trainers were now wearing, that same light started to shroud their own bodies. It was only then that close attention was finally drawn, via the TV cameras in the stadium, to the two larger but identical stones that both Pokémon were wearing as pendants around their necks. Blastoise's stone was a larger version of Nisha's, and likewise, the same proved true for Venusaur and Corey. Then, as the light around the two Pokémon turned into a glow and they started to change and morph, at the same time, their trainers yelled in tandem, "Mega Evolve!" When the bright light show surrounding trainer and Pokémon finally came to an end a few seconds later, Blastoise and Venusaur stood changed before the whole stadium. Blastoise now had just one giant cannon jutting out of its back with two smaller ones coming out of what looked like small Squirtle shells that had suddenly grown atop its arms. Blastoise's face now appeared more sharp and angular, specifically the top of its brow and below the chin, which now came into a point. Venusaur, likewise, had changed. It too was slightly bigger now, like Blastoise, and had 3 green markings on the bridge of its nose. Aside from that, Venusaur had grown a whole other section of leaves on its back, and a flower was also now fully bloomed atop its head. The big one on its back had also grown bigger, and vines now draped down from it into the leaves below, as if connected to and nourishing them. The announcer gave voice to the amazement that everyone in the audience was feeling as he yelled, "Wow, this is amazing! Blastoise and Venusaur have now Mega Evolved into Mega Blastoise and Mega Venusaur. Astounding!" Knowing there was only enough left in their Pokémon for one last explosive, all-out attack, Corey and Nisha yelled at the same time. Brooder Root, Shell Shocker, Use Frenzy Plant, Hydro Cannon. Mega Venusaur rose up on both hind legs and bellowed aloud, "Sour!" before slamming its now glowing body down onto the ground as a small earthquake shook the field. Then, like the very earth itself had come alive, massive roots started erupting from out of the ground and swarmed toward the water type. Raising the 2 cannons on its arms while the one on its back pointed straight ahead, Mega Blastoise gave its own guttural roar as the 3 cannons exploded with high-powered, heavily condensed, dark blue jets of water. Blastoise. Both game-ending attacks seemed to hit at the same time. Mega Blastoise was caught up by multiple giant roots and was sent hurtling high up into the air. Meanwhile, Mega Venusaur was struck dead on by the mighty blasts of water. Corey's last Pokémon was sent flying back across the stadium into the opposite wall while Nisha's own was dropped from high up in the air, almost near the glass dome ceiling, and went plummeting toward the ground below. When Mega Blastoise finally hit, it struck the field so hard that it actually cratered the earth itself. When the vine-like roots of Frenzy Plant disappeared and the action finally settled down, all the stadium looked on with bated breath to see the results of the final bout between the two Mega-evolved Pokémon. Laying in their own respective corners of the stadium, for Venusaur was not even in the arena anymore, neither of them were in their former Mega-evolved states any longer. They had each reverted back to normal and both were now covered in scuff marks, bruises and battle damage. To everyone's amazement, Blastoise and Venusaur slowly managed to stand up while grimacing in pain and panting from the effort it took to do so. They both just as slowly walked back into the center of the arena and before long, the two of them were staring each other down again. Neither one wanted to give in to the other and both refused to lose. However, just when they were about to try and move again, Blastoise's body finally gave out from exhaustion and pain and it fell with a heavy thud, face down, onto the ground. Frenzy Plant had been far more effective on it as a water type than Hydro Cannon had been on Venusaur, being a grass type, and thus, the match had at least been decided. Seeing how Venusaur was the last one standing, the black shorts and green shirt wearing referee, who had been standing safely outside of the field, raised his hand and called the match in favor of Corey and Venusaur. As soon as he did this, the screen up above the arena changed to show a picture of the young man and his Pokémon with the words, "Winner. Congratulations." underneath of it. The crowd soon erupted into wild applause and the announcer began excitedly narrating on the end of the match. Nisha, for her part, smiled softly in disappointment but nonetheless accepted her loss gracefully as she ran up to comfort her defeated Pokémon. Corey, meanwhile, went out to greet his victorious Venusaur and hugged it in gratitude for a battle well fought. Afterward, he looked toward the crowd and held his hands up, smiling and waving to the cheering fans while Venusaur looked around and held its head up proudly. As confetti began falling from the ceiling and the announcer continued to proclaim Corey's victory, he and Nisha looked at each other and shared a handshake and a smile in a sign of good sportsmanship. Then, turning to the crowd of thousands, they both began waving together while Blastoise and Venusaur stood beside of their trainers and basked in the glory. Thus, the Indigo Conference was closed out for another year to the roaring applause of a stadium filled with cheering spectators. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX crossing his arms. He turned down the volume a little and watched the celebrations now taking place to close out the year's big conference competition. As he took in all he had just seen, the young boy whom was about to become a Pokémon trainer himself looked toward the wall on the right side of the TV. He stared at the poster hanging there of Squirtle, Charmander, Bulbasaur in each of their evolutions and then considered all the battling techniques and skills he had just seen in the recent match. Silently contemplating over how he could incorporate some of what those two trainers had demonstrated into his own battling style, Ash stood up and walked over to his other desk that was connected to his bunk bed. There, he looked on the neat pile of things his mother had left for him on the smooth wooden surface beside his open, black laptop. Smiling as he did so, the first thing he did was check out the new outfit his mom had gotten for him. It was an all-black tracksuit with splashes of red here and there. The sleeves of the jacket and the legs of the pants were both interchangeable, meaning that they could be turned into a more comfortable and cooler version of the outfit for hotter, summer weather and any other conditions that called for a shorts and t-shirt occasion. The pants were also lined on the inside, which meant they could double as swim trunks. There were red lines running down the sleeves of the track coat, up around the cuffs, on the collar, at the waist and also at the front of the jacket where the zipper pulled down. There were red streaks going down the sides and along the waistband of the pants as well. To complete the outfit was a pair of cross trainers that were also all black except for red coloring on the sides of the shoes. All in all, Ash was very impressed with the traveling clothes his mother had chosen for him and knew it would suit him perfectly for his soon-to-be life on the road. The apparent versatility of it was important too, since he would always be doing something physical. He then looked to the next items of interest and noticed his survival and camping gear, complete with black sleeping bag, a small compact portable tent, portable cookware and food that his mom had packed for him, as well as his future Pokémon, all rolled up neatly next to a sizable but still manageable looking new traveling pack. The pack was, indeed, quite large, enough to carry all he had, with many different pouches and pockets everywhere. It was even black and red, just like his tracksuit. There were other essential items and random things his well-meaning mother had packed for him as well, and as he went about putting it all away and finding proper places for everything, he soon found himself hoping it would all fit. Which, thankfully, it did. Amazingly, with room to spare. Needless to say, he was very impressed and exceedingly grateful with the supplies that his loving mother had gotten ready for him, and made a mental note to thank her for everything in the morning. After he finished packing up all of his things neatly, finalized the last of his travel plans, even down to what he would do and exactly where he would go after receiving his first Pokémon, Ash laid his new clothes out for the next day. Then, the well-prepared pupil of Professor Oak pulled his desk chair over and sat on it, sighing comfortably as he did. Taking a glance at the Voltorb alarm clock up on the shelf above his bed, Ash saw that it was now 9 o'clock and decided to change the channel on TV to his mentor's own educational one called The Pokémon Hour with Professor Oak. The main part of the Indigo conference he had wanted to see was over now anyway, and what he really wanted to watch before bed was his mentor give his famous, annual pre-first Pokémon lecture. It had been taped a few days before but was only now being played on the evening before the professor gave out 3 starter Pokémon and officially certified the same number of kids as official Pokémon trainers. Actually, this year it was 4 kids coming to be certified. He and Gary were the youngest at 10 years old, while the other 2 were also kids from Pallet, from the actual town itself, who were both 12. However, since there were only 3 Pokémon that the league provided Oak with once every 2 to 3 months, not all of the expected kids would be getting a Pokémon, and Ash knew it. In fact, on the day the filming crew came to the lab to tape the very same lecture he was about to watch now, Professor Oak specifically had told him to make sure he arrived early enough to get his first Pokémon so that he wasn't the one unlucky kid missing out. Of course, Gary was his grandson, so he had been told the same thing. Ash remembered that day well. He had been in the main, ground floor research room at the lab, sitting at his own desk which the professor had pulled up next to his for the boy 5 years prior. It was there that he had done almost all of his actual studying during the entire training stint with the aged researcher who turned out to be a phenomenal teacher. The messy dark-haired boy had just been finishing up with the last tests for his last course of primary school work when the TV crew came in. Apparently, from what the professor had told him later, he didn't do new videos every 2 or 3 months that he got and gave out a round of starter Pokémon. According to the older man that had tutored him in all things Pokémon, the TV station, whom was based out of Viridian City, usually played the same recording over and over for a whole year. It just so happened to be that the one time a year the professor did a new one fell on the same cycle that Ash would be getting his first Pokémon. Turning his attention fully to the screen, Ash saw his teacher standing against a white digital backdrop, which he knew from being there had been created by Professor Oak, standing in front of a wall in the main research area of the lab. The camera crew had then simply projected the necessary backdrop behind him. The gray-haired professor had a metal pointer wand in his hand, which he would use to gesture at the 3 images of Bulbasaur, Squirtle and Charmander projected behind him. Good evening Pallet Town and all prospective young trainers who are watching this. As you well know, tomorrow is the day in which I give out 3 starter Pokémon to 3 very lucky young people and certify them as official Pokémon trainers. He then pointed at each image of the 3 starters in turn. You will have the choice of selecting either Bulbasaur the grass type, Squirtle the water type, or Charmander the fire type. Each of these Pokémon have very unique characteristics and personalities which will benefit a trainer depending upon what kind of person he or she is. as well as what goals they wish to aspire to on their respective journeys. He then closed his metal wand and looked at the camera seriously. I am sure that I do not need to explain the seriousness of how important this process is. So, with that said, for the young individuals that are coming to receive one of these Pokémon, I stress once more for you to take this as a highly serious matter. He then held up a finger. Most importantly, the selection begins tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp, so be sure to arrive on time. Failure to do so will not ensure that you receive any Pokémon at all. Now, as the knowledgeable professor went on a deeper explanation of the 3 Pokémon behind him, Ash watched but only half listened since they were already things he knew well. After the program was over, he turned his TV off, switched his bedroom light off and then climbed up into his bunk bed. Then, after setting his alarm clock, the messy-haired boy laid down and looked up at his ceiling. In his mind he was thinking over which Pokémon he would choose on the morrow, but no matter how hard he tried, he simply couldn't bring himself to get enthused over any particular choice. He had known that his silence on the very subject in question had driven his mother and Professor Oak a little crazy, since he never even once alluded to which of the 3 Kanto starters he preferred. Though, if he was honest with himself, it was simply because he couldn't get excited over any of the choices. As ridiculous as it sounded, his mind and heart was still set on the little Pichu he had saved 5 long years ago before meeting Arceus. He knew how insane it may have sounded, but in those few seconds he had with the small electric type before plummeting off the cliff, Ash felt like some kind of bond had formed between them. Whether it be from him saving Pichu's life or something deeper, he could not say. All he did know for an absolute fact was that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop thinking about the spirited little Pokémon and the fire that he could see burning in its eyes. A look that he had felt reflected in his own. It was a desire to prove oneself, to be greater than expectations, and to possess a strong thirst to rise above all others and be known as something great. That was what he had seen in the short few seconds of looking into Pichu's eyes. He knew that basing the passion for his upcoming decision entirely on a Pokémon he hadn't seen in 5 years and was probably long by now was the very definition of foolish. Yet, he couldn't help himself. Every time he thought about his first Pokémon, that same little Pichu's face came back into his mind's eye, over and over again. With a sigh, Ash rolled over in bed and closed his eyes. As he did so, he tried desperately not to have any further thoughts about the black and yellow little specter that kept flitting in and out of his slowly fading conscious thoughts. However, against his wishes, the last thing he could remember before slipping into a restful, deep sleep was the quick thought of he and the small Pokémon that shall not be named, leaving Pallet Town together and setting off into the bright sun on the beginning of a great journey. Pichu was on his shoulder and they were both smiling and sharing a laugh as the hopeful thought slowly faded away. Though, in its place had been left the serenely smiling, happy face of Ash as he drifted into dreams of his impending travels with the partner Pokémon of his heart's desire present for every second of them.